The wind didn't just blow across Sagehorn Bluffs. It clawed. It was a physical, malicious thing that screamed over the ridges and slammed itself against the high walls of the canyon, searching for any crack to invade. It found plenty in the old bones of Coulter Hayes's barn. It was midnight, or near enough to make no difference. The air, sharp with the electric tang of an early blizzard, tasted of iron and panic. Coulter felt it in his chest before he saw it in the livestock. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter, the rough wool scratching his jaw. He'd lived alone on this ranch for 5 years, ever since the fever took Mary, and solitude had sharpened his senses. He didn't just hear the wind, he heard the splintering whine it made squeezing through the north-facing knothole. He didn't just smell the coming snow, he smelled the metallic fear rising off his longhorns. That's what had pulled him from his bunk. The cattle were lowing, a deep, distressed rumble that vibrated up from the packed earth floor into the soles of his boots. They weren't just restless, they were spooked. He raised the lantern high, the light, oily and yellow, cut a weak circle in the cavernous dark. It glinted off the brass fittings of his harness tack hanging on the wall, and caught the wide, white eyes of his mare in the first stall. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice a low gravel that the wind immediately stole. He moved deeper into the barn, past the stalls and toward the great stack of winter hay that stood like a mountain against the back wall. The wind was loudest here, rattling the tin roof sheets so hard he thought they might peel off and sail into the darkness. The longhorns were clustered near the doors, as far from the back wall as they could get. He scanned the perimeter. No busted planks, no coyote or wolf tracks in the thin layer of dust and spilled feed. Yet the air remained tight, like a held breath. He stopped. Over the shriek of the storm and the shuffling of hooves, he heard it, a sound that did not belong. A hitch, a quick, sharp intake of air. It came from the hay. Coulter's hand went instinctively to the Colt holstered at his hip, the leather smooth and familiar against his palm. He wasn't a man prone to violence, but he was a man prepared for it. Living 30 miles from the nearest semblance of law, in a town like Copperfinch Crossing, preparation was what kept you breathing. He moved the lantern forward, stepping soft. "Show yourself," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority within these 4 walls. The hay rustled. He saw a flash of dark fabric burrowing deeper. "I won't ask twice," he said, moving closer. "That hay's feed, not a bed." He reached the stack and held the lantern directly over the indentation. It wasn't a vagrant. It wasn't a drunk cowboy sleeping off a bad night. It was a woman. She was coiled into a tight ball, like a field mouse hiding from a hawk. Her coat was thin, stained with alkali dust and dark patches that could have been mud or old blood. Her hair, the color of damp straw, was matted and stuck to her face. As the light hit her, she flinched, not like someone waking up, but like someone expecting a blow. Her eyes snapped open. They were wide, terrified, and startlingly clear blue in the lantern glow. She scrambled backward, pushing herself deeper into the hay, her hands coming up to shield her face. "No," she whispered, the word broken. "Please, don't send me back. Don't." Coulter froze. His mind, usually so clear, stumbled. He'd expected a threat, a drifter, maybe even an outlaw. He had not expected this. This was something else. This was trouble of a different, more complicated vintage. He lowered the lantern slightly, trying to soften the harsh glare. He kept his voice low, the same tone he used on a spooked filly. "Easy now. No one's sending you anywhere. Not in this." As if to prove his point, a crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead. The barn shuddered, and a cascade of dust fell from the rafters. The woman cried out, a small, smothered sound, and pressed herself flatter. He saw her cheek. A long, angry scratch ran from her temple to her jawline, beaded with fresh blood, as if she'd been dragged through thorny brush. Her lips were cracked and pale. This wasn't a journey. This was a flight. Coulter took a step back, giving her air. He hung the lantern on a nearby post. plunging the corner back into shadow, but filling the barn center with a warmer, steadier light. He unhooked a heavy horse blanket from a stall door clean, smelling of wool and saddle soap. He tossed it gently onto the straw near her. "You're shiverin'," he said gruffly. "Cover up." She watched him, her breathing coming in fast, painful rasps. She didn't move for the blanket. Her eyes darted from his face to the barn door, calculating. "I mean you no harm, ma'am," Coulter said, his patience thinning. "But you're on my land, and my cattle are spooked. I need to know what you're running from." As he spoke, her hand, hidden beneath her, moved. It was a reflexive, protective gesture. She was lying on something. He saw her fingers curl around a shape beneath the loose hay. He watched her, saying nothing. Her eyes followed his gaze. She knew he'd seen. Slowly, as if to prove it wasn't a weapon. She shifted. It was a book, a small, leather-bound journal, scarred and weathered. It was held shut by a single, strikingly bright, red silk ribbon. Tied to the ribbon, dangling like a strange charm, was half of a brass key. Its stem snapped clean. She didn't just hold it, she guarded it, pulling it tight against her stomach, her knuckles white. Before Coulter could frame his next question, a new sound cut through the storm. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but it was unmistakable. Hoofbeats. They were distant, moving slow, maybe a mile off, down by the creek bed. They weren't the frantic rhythm of a horse in a storm. They were measured, searching. Coulter looked at the woman. Her head was cocked, her entire body rigid. She'd heard them, too. The terror in her eyes sharpened into something raw. He moved to the barn side door, cracked it open a bare inch, and peered into the swirling gray chaos of the oncoming blizzard. The wind tore at his face. He couldn't see anything, but he didn't need to. He knew that sound. It was the sound of men who weren't stopping for weather, men who were tracking. He shut the door, the latch clicking softly into place. The finality of the sound echoed in the sudden quiet of the barn, as if the storm itself were holding its breath. He turned back to the woman. He didn't have time for manners. "Someone hunting you." She stared at him, her chest heaving. The lie was on her lips. He could see her battling with it. But the sound of the horses, distant as they were, had broken her. She gave a single, jerking nod. Her chin trembled, but she bit down on her lip, refusing to make another sound. Coulter Hayes stood in the middle of his barn and weighed the next 10 seconds. He was a solitary man. He didn't meddle. Copperfinch Crossing was a town held together by railroad money and telegraph wires, and the men who ran that railroad didn't take kindly to interference. They employed men who operated in the gray spaces between the law and the gun. Harboring a fugitive, and she was clearly a fugitive, was an invitation for a fire in the night, or a bullet from a ridge line. It meant pitting his small, isolated ranch against whatever powerful, faceless entity she had crossed. He looked at her again. She was just a girl, maybe 23, 24. She was exhausted, scratched to pieces, and clinging to a ribbon-tied book as if it were her last anchor in the world. Mary would have helped her. The thought came to him, unwelcome and sharp. He let out a long breath. The decision was made. With 2 quick movements, he walked to the main lantern and turned the wick down, plunging the barn into deep, comforting shadow. He left only a small stable lamp burning in the far corner, near the tack room, just enough to cast a pale, warm glow that wouldn't be seen from the trail. "Get up," he ordered, his voice flat. She flinched. "Please, I'm not kicking you out. I'm moving you." He walked to his mare's stall, unlatched the door, and led the horse out. "Staying by the hay is foolish. It's the first place they'll look." He led the mare to an empty stall at the far end, one hidden behind the corn crib. "You'll stay here, with her. She'll keep you warm. Don't make a sound." Lila, he didn't know her name yet, but he saw the L stitched on her worn sleeve cuff scrambled to her feet, clutching the horse blanket and the journal. She stumbled, her legs weak from cold and running. He pointed. "In, now." She hurried into the stall, huddling in the corner. The mare, sensing her fear, snorted softly but stood calm. Coulter picked up the pitchfork. He didn't hide her tracks. He obscured them. He spent a minute turning over the hay where she had lain, spreading fresh feed, making it look like he'd been tending to a sick calf. The storm hit full force. A sheet of icy rain, driven by the wind, hammered the tin roof. The sound was deafening, a frantic drumming that swallowed all other noise. It was cover. Lila's breath was coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were clamped over her mouth, her knuckles pressed white against her teeth. She was still clutching that book. Coulter finished his work. He looked at the stall. It was a poor hiding place, but the best he had. He walked past her, toward the small tack room that doubled as his workshop. He lit the small pot-belly stove, the kindling catching with a sharp whoosh. He filled a battered tin pot with water from his canteen and spooned in coffee grounds black, thick, and strong. He set it on the stove to boil. The aroma of coffee, bitter and smoky, began to fight back against the cold. He looked back at the stall. She hadn't moved. He pointed to a sturdy wooden crate turned on its end, well away from the doors, but close enough to the stove to catch its warmth. "You're safe here," he said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the rain's roar. "Till morning." He didn't offer more. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask about the book, or the men, or the key. Morning would be time enough for that, if they lived to see it. Lila Merrick watched him for a long moment. She saw the set of his jaw, the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. She slid out of the stall, wrapping the heavy blanket around her shoulders. She moved to the crate and sank down, her legs trembling so badly she nearly fell. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were barely audible. Coulter just grunted in response, pouring the boiling, sludgy coffee into a tin mug. He pushed it across the floor toward her. She cupped it in both hands, letting the heat sink into her frozen fingers. Her eyes closed, just for a second, the first moment of safety she'd felt in days, but her ears were still alert, straining to hear past the wind, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that were no longer fading, and far off, beyond the bluffs, beyond the storm, another sound pierced the night. It was a long, mournful wail, the cry of iron on iron. The midnight train, pushing its way west. The railroad was coming, and with it, Coulter knew, came all the trouble in the world. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world scrubbed raw and dripping. The silence that followed was louder than the wind had been. It was a cold, expectant hush, the air smelling of wet pine and ozone. Coulter Hayes hadn't slept. He'd spent the last few hours on the porch, his rifle across his knees, watching the gray light seep over the bluffs. He'd listened to the woman Lila finally succumb to an exhausted, fitful sleep in the tack room, her breathing punctuated by small, sharp gasps, as if even in dreams she was still running. When the light was strong enough to see by, he moved. The ground was a slurry of mud and melting ice. He walked the perimeter of his property, his boots making sucking sounds in the muck. He didn't go to the main trail. He went to the creek bed, the low ground, and he found them. Not one set of tracks, but 3, horseshoes, new and sharp-edged, pressed deep into the mud. They had come up from the south, skirted his fence line, staying just out of rifle range, and looped back toward the main road to Copper Finch Crossing. They hadn't been fleeing the storm. They had been patrolling, waiting. The blizzard had been their cover. They knew she was here, or near here. They had pinpointed the ranch. Coulter's jaw tightened. He spat the bitter taste of coffee grounds and anger onto the wet earth. He was no longer just a man offering shelter. He was a mark. He walked back to the barn, his strides long and heavy. The air was still, too still. Lila was awake when he entered. She was standing by the stove, her hands wrapped around the tin mug he'd given her, now long cold. She looked smaller in the daylight, and the scratch on her cheek was a dark, angry purple. Her eyes, wide and haunted, snapped to his. "They're gone," she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "They were here," Coulter said, his voice flat. He shut the heavy barn door. the sound echoing in the cavernous space. 3 riders circled the property while the storm was blowing. They're professionals, not some posse. The blood drained from her face. But they left. They went to town, Coulter said. They'll be back. He looked around the barn, the stalls, the hayloft. All of it too obvious. You can't stay here. This is the first place they'll toss. He pointed to her feet. The thin, ruined slippers she wore were soaked through, caked in mud and straw. You won't get 10 feet in those. He disappeared into the tack room for a moment and came back with a pair of boots. They were men's boots, but small, worn soft with use. The leather cured to a dark brown, Mary's riding boots. He hadn't looked at them in 5 years. He tossed them onto the dirt floor in front of her. Put 'em on. They'll hold. Lila looked at the boots, then at his face. She saw the flicker of old pain in his eyes, the hardness he used to cover it. She sat on the crate and, without a word, pulled them on. They were a size too large, but with thick socks, they felt solid, safe. Where are we going? We aren't going anywhere. Coulter said, You are. He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp. Come on, and bring that book. He led her out the back door of the barn, across a 30-yard stretch of exposed mud, to a smaller, dilapidated structure leaning against the north fence. It was the old Clover shed. Its roof was patched with tin, and one wall sagged, but the door was solid oak. It's not much, he said, pulling the heavy door open. The inside smelled sweet and dry, a stark contrast to the manure and damp hay of the main barn. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from a cracked window. But they won't look here first. They'll go for the house, then the barn. This just looks like it'll fall over. He pointed to a stack of old, dried clover bales in the darkest corner. Get behind there, and stay silent. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't even think, no matter what you hear. Lila nodded, her hand instinctively going to her waist, where Coulter could see the shape of the journal pressed beneath her coat. Don't lose that book, he said. It wasn't a question. I won't, she whispered, her voice fierce. It's all I have. She slipped behind the bales, disappearing into the shadows. Coulter shut the heavy door, dropping a wooden bar into place on the outside, locking her in. It was a prison, but it was also a fortress. He had just made it back to the main barn, pitchfork in hand, scattering hay to cover his tracks, when he heard it, the unmistakable rhythmic pounding of horses at a hard trot. They were back, and they hadn't waited for noon. He heard the heavy, arrogant slam of the front gate swinging open. A voice, smooth and cold, called out, Hayes, Coulter Hayes, we know you're in there. We're official business. Coulter took a long, slow breath. He left the pitchfork leaning against the wall and walked out of the barn, squinting into the pale morning sun. 3 men. They had dismounted and were standing by his front porch. The leader was a tall man in a clean, black duster, his face clean-shaven, which was rare in these parts. He looked more like a banker from back east than a tracker. The other 2 were thick-set, rougher, their hands hovering near the peacemakers holstered on their hips. That's near enough, gentlemen, Coulter called out, stopping a good 20 yards from them. He kept his hands loose at his sides. The leader smiled, a thin, reptilian gesture that didn't touch his eyes. Mr. Hayes, my name is Silas Vane. We're investigators for the Transcontinental Union Railroad. He produced a piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was crisp, white, and looked utterly useless. We have a warrant to search this property for lost corporate assets. Coulter didn't move. A warrant? You'd have to have ridden to the county seat and back in under an hour. That's hard riding. We acquired this from the local magistrate in Copperfinch Crossing, Vane said, the smile tightening. Judge Abernathy, I presume. Coulter said. Vane's eyes hardened. You're familiar with him. Good. That saves time. We are looking for a woman. Name of Lila Merrick. She's a thief. We tracked her to this valley. A valley's a big place, Coulter said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Lots of places to hide. We'll start with this one." Vane said, "The barn." Coulter let his gaze drift over Vane, then to the two men behind him. One of them, a thick-necked man with a scar on his chin, was idly adjusting his glove. As he pulled the leather tight, his sleeve rode up, revealing a stark, black tattoo on the inside of his wrist. It was a single letter, a stylized, elaborate P, Pike, Bartholomew Pike. The man whose name was whispered in every saloon and general store from here to the territories. The man who was the railroad. Coulter looked back at Vane. "Nothing here but hay and bulls. Mister, and the bulls are spooked from the storm. You go tromping in there, you'll likely get gored. And my longhorns are worth more than your fancy paperwork." Vane's facade of politeness cracked. "We are not asking—" "Hayes." He nodded to his two men. They started walking toward the barn. Inside the clover shed, Lila was pressed so flat against the back wall she could feel the splinters through her coat. She heard the voices Coulter's, a low and steady rumble. The other, higher, sharper, full of a slick authority. Then she heard footsteps, heavy, crunching in the mud, right outside her wall. One of Vane's men was circling the property, checking the outbuildings. She heard the boots scuff against the wooden plank just inches from her face. A pause. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could smell the cheap tobacco smoke from his cigarillo. She felt the doorknob rattle. It held firm. The man grunted, then moved on. Lila let out a silent, shaking breath. Her hands went to her waist, her fingers gripping the leather-bound journal so hard her nails dug into the cover. She was ready. If that door broke, she would go out the back, through the loose planks she'd already spotted. She would run until her legs gave out. Back in the yard, Vane's men reached the barn door. Coulter stood in their way. "I'm telling you," Coulter said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's a bad idea. Stand aside." The scarred man growled, putting his hand on the door. Just then, a commotion erupted from the side pen, a high-pitched, panicked bawling. "What the hell is that?" Vane asked. Annoyed. "The calves," Coulter said, his face a mask of frustration. "The storm's got 'em riled up. They'll break the fence." "Then handle it." Vane snapped. "Fine." Coulter shot back. He stomped over to the side pen, a small enclosure holding about 30 yearlings. The calves were agitated, slamming against the thin wooden gate. Coulter didn't just open the gate. He yanked the pin and kicked the wooden latch so hard it splintered. The gate flew open. It was instant. Bovine chaos. 30 panicked calves, all legs and wide eyes, exploded into the main yard. They weren't a stampede of full-grown bulls, but they were a tide of terrified, 1,000-pound bodies. They flooded the space between the barn and the house. Vane and his men cursed, diving out of the way. The scarred man was knocked flat, falling back into a trough of muddy rainwater. The other man scrambled onto the porch. Vane himself, trying to maintain his dignity, was buffeted by a half-dozen yearlings, his clean duster plastered in mud and filth. The yard filled with a choking cloud of dust from the drier spots and a spray of muck from the wet ones. The air was full of bellows and the thunder of small hooves. "Damn it! Hayes! Get your animals!" Vane shrieked, wiping a streak of manure from his face. "Told you they were skittish!" Coulter yelled over the din. He grabbed a rope, acting the part of the flustered rancher, and half-heartedly began swinging it, which only served to scatter the calves further. It was a perfect, beautiful mess. It took a full 5 minutes for the calves to disperse, streaming out of the open main gate and onto the prairie. Vane stood in the center of the ruined yard, his duster dripping. His clean-shaven face was mottled with rage. The professional mask was gone, replaced by the raw malice of a man who had been made a fool of. "You think you're clever, rancher," Vane hissed, his voice trembling. "I think my herd scattered to hell and back, thanks to you," Coulter shot back, his own anger feeling very real. Vane walked right up to him, his eyes like chips of ice. "We'll be back, and not with a polite piece of paper." He jabbed a finger toward town. "I'm going to see Judge Abernathy. I'm going to get a real warrant, one that deputizes my men. We'll be back by noon. And when we come back, we're not just searching this barn, we're tearing it, and your house, and every damn shed, down to the foundation. You understand me?" The threat was clear. New paperwork, a bribe, a legal way to destroy him. "You're trespassing," Coulter said, his voice low. "Get off my land." Vane smiled, a real smile this time, full of malice. For now, he and his men mounted up. The scarred man gave Coulter a look that promised pure retribution. They rode out, leaving the main gate swinging wide open. Coulter didn't move. He watched them until they were small specks on the ridge. He counted to 100, slowly. Then he moved. First, he closed and barred the main gate. He spent a few minutes rounding up the nearest calves, his movements calm and economical. Then he went to the main barn. He grabbed a hammer and a few bent nails. He went to the heavy side door and looked at the hinges. They were old, rusted, and groaned every time the door moved. He spent 2 minutes hammering, not fixing the squeak, but repairing the wood around the hinge, seating it just a little bit wrong. When he was done, opening the door made a sound like a tortured banshee, a high-pitched metallic scream that could be heard clear across the ranch, a perfect alarm bell. He rebarred the main doors. He checked the loading bay. Then, and only then, did he go to the clover shed. He lifted the bar and opened the door. Lila was standing in the middle of the small room, her body shaking, but her eyes were dry and hot with fury. "I heard," she said. "Noon." "That gives us maybe 2 hours, if we're lucky," Coulter said. He walked past her, kicking at the clover bales. "They'll be back with the law on their side, bought and paid for." He turned to face her, his expression grim. "I just put my ranch, my stock, and my life on the line for you. Ma'am, I did it blind. I'm not doing it twice." He held out his hand. "I need to know. What is in that book that makes Bartholomew Pike's men willing to tear my world apart to get it?" Lila looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face. The time for running was over. The time for secrets was done. She reached into her coat and pulled out the leather-bound journal. The red ribbon was a slash of color in the dusty shed. It's a ledger," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "I was a clerk for the railroad's land acquisition office." She took a ragged breath. "They're pushing a new line through the Bitterroot Fork. The land they're claiming isn't the land they're building on. They're cheating, pushing families off their homesteads, claiming the deeds are faulty. That's land theft," Coulter said. "It's not new." "This is," she said, her fingers tightening on the cover. "This isn't just theft. This is the proof. It's the real maps, the real survey lines, overlaid with the fake ones they filed with the county, and it's the payroll." Coulter frowned. "Payroll? A second payroll," Lila said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "For security contractors, men who aren't on the company books, the men they pay to convince people to sell, the men they pay to start fires, to spook cattle, the men they pay for accidents." Her eyes met his, and he saw the full, terrible weight of what she was carrying. "It's not just proof of the land," she said, her voice breaking. "It's proof of the blood money." A sharp whistle cut the air. Coulter spun, rifle up, moving to the door in one fluid motion. "Get down! Hold your fire! Coulter, it's just me!" A horse and rider appeared at the fence line, stopping well short of the yard. The rider was small, wearing canvas trousers and a heavy coat. Coulter lowered the rifle, but his body stayed tense. Tamsin, Deputy Tamsin Doyle, swung off her horse. She was the closest thing Copperfinch Crossing had to honest law, a woman in her late 30s with wary eyes and a pragmatism that kept her alive. She usually wore her badge on her vest, but today, Coulter noted, it was pinned inside her coat, hidden. "Saw Vane and his hounds in town," Tamsin called out, walking toward him, her gaze sweeping the yard, noting the calf tracks, the mud, the splintered gate. "They were headed straight for Judge Abernathy's chambers. Looked like they'd been in a mudslide. Figured I'd come see if you were still in one piece." Her eyes flicked to the clover shed, to the shadow standing just behind Coulter. "Who's your friend?" "This," Coulter said, stepping aside, "is the lost corporate asset they were looking for." Lila stepped into the pale light, clutching the journal to her chest. Tamsin's eyes went wide. She swore, a short, sharp curse. "Lord, you're her, the girl from the telegraph dispatch, the absconded clerk." "I didn't steal anything," Lila said, her voice steady. "I just took what they didn't want found." Tamsin looked back toward town, her face grim. "Vane's not just getting a warrant, girl. He's getting a posse. The judge will sign anything Pike puts in front of him, and he'll make it legal. They'll be back here by noon, and they won't be knocking." "What do we do?" Lila asked. Looking at Coulter, Tamsin chewed her lip. "The courthouse is compromised. The sheriff's on the payroll. But there's one man in this town Pike hasn't bought. Ephraim Cole." Coulter said. Tamsin nodded. "The public attorney. He's stubborn, he's smart, and he hates the railroad." She looked at the book in Lila's hands. "If that ledger holds half of what I think it holds all of it." Lila said, "Then we have to get it to him." Tamsin said, her decision made, "Not to the courthouse, to his office, now." Coulter looked at the sun. It was climbing. 10 o'clock. Maybe later. "We don't have till noon," he said. "We have till they get back. Then we ride," Tamsin said, pulling her hat low. "And we ride fast." The air in the clover shed was thick with the scent of dried herbs and the metallic tang of fear. Tamsin was already outside, her movements quick and silent as she saddled 3 horses. Keeping to the blind side of the barn, Coulter stood by the door, his rifle held easy in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the empty ridge line. The quiet was a taut-stretched wire. "You said it was a payroll," Coulter said, his voice low, not looking at Lila. "And blood money." Lila was standing where he'd left her, by the bales. The borrowed boots felt like anchors, heavy and real. "It is. That's not enough," he said. "Vane's not just a tracker. He's a company man. High up. Pike doesn't send a man like that for a simple land dispute. He sends him to bury something. Or someone." He finally turned, his gaze pinning her. "I'm riding into Copperfinch with a target on my back, my own town. I need to know exactly what's in that book." Lila's hands tightened on the journal. She owed him this. She owed him more than this. "I wasn't always Lila Merrick," she began, her voice barely a whisper. That's the 3rd name I've used. I started as Eliana Vance. I was hired on as a ledger clerk at the railroad's regional office in Omaha. It was a good job. $20 a month, plus board." She could see the office now, smell the oiled wood of the desks, the sharp bite of new ink, the dry, papery scent of money. She'd been proud. She was good with numbers, the columns always balanced. "My supervisor," she continued, "was Silas Vane." Coulter's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing. "The man from this morning." "The same," she confirmed, a bitter taste in her mouth. "He was polished, polite. He trusted me. He gave me the acquisition ledgers, confidential reports. He called them, at first, it was all normal. Paying settlers for right-of-way. Standard vouchers." She paused, lost in the memory. "Then I started seeing the other vouchers, the ones that came from a separate fund, the contingency and security ledger." Her mind went back to that dusty, oversized book, hidden on a bottom shelf. It was a ghost payroll, names I didn't recognize, cashing vouchers for pasture guarding, or survey protection, $50 here, $100 there. But the dates were what caught my eye. She looked at Coulter, her own eyes dark with the memory. 2 days after a pasture guarding payment, a homesteader's well would be spoiled. A week after a survey protection voucher, a man's barn would burn. And the next day, that same homesteader, his spirit broken, would sell his land to Pike's agent for 10 cents on the dollar. Coulter said nothing, but a muscle in his jaw jumped. "I thought it was just Vane," she whispered. "A man skimming greed." I kept digging. I cross-referenced the security payroll with the land acquisitions. Every single payment lined up with a disaster. Every disaster lined up with a cheap sale. They weren't just securing the line, they were clearing it. The barn was silent, save for the distant, nervous stamp of a horse. "The book," she said, holding the journal up, "is my own work. I started copying the names, the dates, the amounts. I spent 3 nights, after everyone left, poring over the survey maps, and I found it, tucked inside a county atlas from 2 years prior. The real surveyor's map." She licked her dry lips. Pike's men weren't just clearing the legal right-of-way. They were clearing a path twice as wide, grabbing all the land with water rights, all the good timber, all the grazing land, using a fake map to justify it at the land office. This book has the real map, sketched by my own hand, laid over the fake one. It has the names of the pasture guards. It has the dates of the fires, and it has, her voice cracked, it has his signature, Bartholomew Pike. I found a wire transfer approval, a bonus, he called it, for expediently settling the Bitterroot Fork accounts. $500, signed by him. He didn't just know, he ordered it. She looked down at the red ribbon, as if seeing it for the first time. "Mr. Vane, he found me with the ledgers. He didn't yell, he smiled. He told me I'd found a clerical error and that I should correct the books, erase the ghost payroll, burn the original map. I told him no." "The next morning," she finished, her voice flat, "there was a warrant out for my arrest. Eliana Vance, wanted for theft of company property. They claimed I stole $300. Vane stood right there, in the marshal's office, and pointed at me. I ran. I ran out the back. I got to the station, bought a ticket with the last of my pay. I became Sarah at the first stop, then June at the second. By the time I crossed into this territory, I was Lila Merrick. I've been running for 3 weeks. This book, this is the only thing that proves I'm not a thief. It's the only thing that proves those people, those families weren't just bad luck." The story hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Coulter turned his back to her, looking out the cracked window of the shed. The silence stretched, filled only by Lila's unsteady breathing. He knew about bad luck. He saw the creek, not as it was now, a tame ribbon of mud, but as it had been a year ago. A roaring, brown monster, swollen by 3 days of rain. He saw the water licking at the porch of his cabin. He saw Mary, her face pale, her body shaking with a chill that had nothing to do with the damp. She hadn't been in the flood. She had been after it. The dampness had settled into the house, into the walls, into her lungs. A cough, then a fever. He'd ridden to Copperfinch Crossing twice in one day for quinine that did nothing. He'd sat by her bedside for 2 weeks, holding her hand, watching the spark in her eyes dim. He'd watched her taken by something he couldn't fight, couldn't reason with, couldn't shoot. When she was gone, the silence of the ranch, once a comfort, became a prison. He stopped going to town. He stopped talking to his neighbors. He'd fixed the water damage, but the hollow it left in him that remained. He hadn't trusted the land, the sky, or another person since. "A year ago," he said, his voice rough, surprising himself. "My wife, Mary, she died. A fever after the flood." He turned, and for the first time, he truly looked at Lila. He wasn't seeing a fugitive, or a problem, or a corporate asset. He was seeing a woman who, like him, had been run over by something vast and uncaring. The difference was, Pike's flood was man-made, and she was trying to build a dam. His loneliness, a cold, hard stone in his gut, suddenly felt the smallest pinprick of warmth. It wasn't pity. It was something sharper. Recognition. This woman, with her terrified eyes and her iron spine, was the first person in a year who had looked him in the face and not just seen a widower. 2 solitary, parallel lines, drawn by grief and by flight, had just been forced to cross. Tamsin reappeared at the door, her face a grim mask. "Horses are ready. We ride north through Larkspur Bend. It's softer ground, harder to track. We can follow the dry creek bed into town and come up behind the saloon. Avoid the main street." She looked at Lila, then at the book in her hands. "But you both need to know what we're riding into. Ephraim Cole is an honest man, but he's just one man." She kicked at a clump of mud. "You think Vane and his men are the problem? The problem is the town itself. Bartholomew Pike's money is in everything. The planks on the sidewalk, the feed at the general store, the whiskey at the saloon." She jerked her chin toward the unseen town. "You go to trial with this. Who do you think sits on that jury? It'll be Jedediah Smith, who owes Pike $500 on his hardware store. It'll be Old Man Hemlock, whose son got a job as a telegraph operator thanks to Pike's influence. You'll be facing a jury of 12 men who have been bought and paid for. Whether they know it or not, they'll call you a liar, a thief, and worse. And the judge will smile and stamp the paper that sends you to the gallows." Tamsin's warning was stark. A douse of cold water. Lila looked down at the book. All those weeks of running, the cold nights in barns, the hunger, the fear, it all came down to this. Tamsin was offering her a truth that was harder than any lie, even with the proof. She would probably lose. She could run. She could take the horse Coulter was offering and just disappear. Go west, become Anna or Grace in some other town. Burn the book. Live a long, quiet, haunted life. She thought of the families, the spoiled wells, the burned barns. She thought of Silas Vane's polite, dead-eyed smile as he told her to correct the truth. "If I run now," Lila said, her voice quiet but vibrating with a new, cold anger, "they bury me anyway. They bury my name, and they bury the truth. I'd rather be buried for real, knowing I told it." She looked up, first at Tamsin, then at Coulter. "I'm riding to Ephraim Cole. Today." Tamsin nodded, a flicker of grim respect in her eyes. "All right, girl. Then let's go face the devil." Coulter hadn't spoken. He'd been watching Lila. He wasn't a man who hated Pike. Hate was an emotion, and he'd been running dry on those for a year. Pike was just a fact, like the weather or the plague. But as he watched Lila make her choice, it wasn't hate he felt. It was a slow, unfamiliar burn. It was admiration. She was terrified, but she was standing her ground. She was standing on his land, wearing his dead wife's boots, and she was choosing to fight. He looked at the rifle in his hands, then at her. He didn't want to fight for a cause, but he found, to his own surprise, that he was willing to fight for her, for the stubborn, ragged, terrifying honesty in her eyes. "I'll get you to Cole," he said. It was all he offered, but it was everything. He led the way to the main barn, Tamsin moving ahead to check the trail one last time. For a moment, Coulter and Lila were alone in the vast, shadowed space. Dust motes, stirred by their movement, swam in the air. A single, brilliant shaft of morning sun lanced through a high, dirty window. It cut through the gloom and struck the small, leather-bound book in Lila's hands. The light seemed to set the frayed red silk ribbon ablaze, a stark, crimson promise against the dusty brown of the leather. It was a silent oath, a knot being pulled tight. Coulter held out the reins to his mare, the horse he'd led her to the night before. "Her name is Steady," he said. "She'll carry you." Lila took the reins, her small, scratched hand brushing his. The touch was brief, electric, and gone. "Let's ride," Coulter said, swinging up onto his own gelding. They moved, not with the frantic scramble of fugitives, but with the cold, measured purpose of a changing tide. Tamsin took the lead, her small frame low over her horse's neck. Coulter rode rear guard, his rifle resting across his saddle horn, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline they'd left behind. Lila was in the middle, a position of protection, her horse steady, sensing the urgency and matching Tamsin's pace without prompting. She had the journal tucked inside her coat, wrapped in an oilskin pouch Coulter had pressed into her hands. It felt like a block of ice against her ribs, a heavy, cold weight that was either an anchor or a millstone. They didn't take the main trail. Tamsin led them straight into Larkspur Bend, the wide, shallow riverbed that snaked behind Coulter's property. The storm had turned it into a half-mile-wide expanse of dark, sucking sand and shallow, braided streams. It was treacherous going. But as Coulter had intended, their tracks vanished the moment they were made, the soft, wet earth folding in on itself, washed clean by the slow-moving water. The world was silent, save for the rhythmic splashing of the horses' hooves and the drip of water from the cottonwoods lining the bank. The air was sharp, smelling of wet rock and decay. After 10 minutes, Tamsin held up a hand. They stopped. She dismounted, her boots sinking to the ankle in mud. She walked to a cluster of stones, picked up 3 flat, gray ones, and placed them in a neat, impossible stack on a larger boulder. She didn't look back. She mounted up and moved on. Lila looked at Coulter, confused. "Trail sign," Coulter murmured, his voice barely disturbing the air. "She's telling anyone who knows how to read it that 3 riders passed this way, but she's also telling them something else. It's her mark. It means the law is involved." It was a warning and a claim, but Vane's men wouldn't be reading signs. They'd be hunting. Coulter had prepared for this. Before they left, he'd taken an extra 5 minutes. He'd rigged a travois 2 long poles lashed to his pack mule's saddle. On it, he'd strapped a scarecrow from his dead cornfield, dressed in his own spare duster and hat. He'd led the mule to a fork in the bend, slapped its rump, and sent it trotting down the other path, the one that led wide toward the open plains. The travois kicked up a visible, messy trail, a false scent for Vane's hounds. They rode on, deeper into the canyon. Lila, clutching the reins, found her fingers moving against her thigh. It was an unconscious, nervous habit. She was tracing the symbols, the shorthand she'd invented in the ledger room in Omaha. A crosshatch for voucher, a circle with a dot for pike, a small triangle for fire. It was a way of holding on to herself, a scribe's prayer in a language no one else knew. Tamsin stopped again. This time, she didn't dismount. She was a statue, her head cocked, listening. "What?" Coulter whispered, moving his horse alongside hers. "Hi," Tamsin hissed. "On the ridge, Yucca Hill." Lila squinted, her heart climbing into her throat. High above them, on the canyon's northern rim. She saw it, a glint of sunlight off something metal, a rifle barrel, then a shape, a man on horseback, silhouetted against the pale sky. "He's seen us," Lila breathed. "He's not alone," Tamsin said, her voice grim. She pointed downriver, to the mouth of the bend. "Look, 2 more riders." They were moving up the riverbed, coming straight at them. It was the scarred man with the P tattoo, and the other hired gun. They'd found the pack mule, they'd seen the ruse, and Vane had been smart enough to split his forces. "He's got us in a pincer," Coulter said, his voice cold. "The men on the ridge to pin us, the men in the bend to flush us. He's hurting us. Tamsin." "Hurting us where?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "Into the open," Coulter replied. "Away from town." As if summoned by his words, the first shot rang out. Crack! The sound was flat, a whip crack that echoed off the canyon walls. It wasn't meant to hit. The bullet kicked up a plume of sand 20 yards to their left. It was a command. "Move!" The riders on the ridge were moving, paralleling them. The riders in the bend spurred their horses into a gallop. Coulter didn't hesitate. He wasn't a man who panicked. He was a man who acted. "Hard right, Lila, now." He grabbed the bridle of her horse. Steady, and hauled. He spurred his own gelding, forcing both animals to lunge from the riverbed up a steep, crumbling embankment. Tamsin was right behind them. They burst through a screen of willows and onto a small, rocky plateau. Another shot zinged through the air, striking sparks off the rock face just behind Lila's head. She cried out, flattening herself against the horse's neck. "Behind the rocks!" Coulter roared. He half threw her from the saddle, pushing her behind a massive cluster of red sandstone boulders that stood like a fortress. The horses, terrified, huddled with them. They were pinned. Below, the 2 riders were dismounting, taking cover, preparing to advance. Above, the men on the ridge had a clear line of sight. "They're taking their time," Tamsin panted, reloading her revolver. "They don't want to kill us. Not yet. They want the book. They want her." "They're not getting her," Coulter said. His face was a mask of cold fury. He peered through a crack in the rock. The men below were advancing on foot. The men above were sliding their way down a game trail. They were closing the net. Coulter scanned the terrain. He knew this land. He knew every rock, every wash, every snake hole. His eyes fixed on a narrow gap in the rock wall just to their left. A shadowed cleft that looked like a dead end. It wasn't. "My steers," he whispered. "What?" Tamsin asked. "My north pasture. It's just through that gap. A small box canyon. I keep 30 head of my best longhorns there." He looked at Tamsin, a wild, dangerous light in his eyes. "Tamsin, you and Lila, keep them busy. Don't waste shots. Just make 'em keep their heads down." "Coulter, what?" He was already gone, sliding off his horse. He grabbed his rifle and scrambled up the side of the sandstone, moving like a mountain cat. He disappeared over the top. Lila pressed her back against the rock, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. She could hear the men below, calling to each other. "Just give us the girl. Hayes Pike only wants the girl." Tamsin leveled her rifle over the rock. "Take another step and I'll test that theory," she yelled. She fired, the shot echoing. A man cursed. Lila fumbled with the revolver Coulter had given her back at the ranch. She'd never fired it. She pointed it over the rock and, closing her eyes, pulled the trigger. The bang and the recoil slammed her shoulder back against the stone, stinging her hand. "Eyes open, girl," Tamsin snapped, "or don't shoot at all." And then they heard it. It started as a low rumble, a vibration in the soles of their boots. It grew, like the sound of a midnight train, or the storm from the night before. It was the sound of the earth itself, angry. "What is that?" Lila asked, her eyes wide. Tamsin's head snapped toward the narrow gap. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. "That," she said, "is Coulter's answer." A single, terrified bellow cut the air. Coulter appeared on the ledge above them, sliding back down in a cloud of dust. "Get on the horses, get on now." He hauled Lila onto Steady's back, vaulted onto his own. "Tamsin, I'm ready. When I say move." Coulter yelled over the growing roar. "You ride with them. Don't fight it. You stay on the edge. Ride with the flow. Go!" He slapped Steady's rump. Hard. The first longhorn burst from the narrow pass. It was a massive bull, horns 6 feet across, its eyes white with terror from the gunshots Coulter had fired behind it. It wasn't one. It was a tide, a river of brown. Churning, panicked beef exploded from the pass. 30 head of longhorns. A solid wall of horns and hooves thundered onto the plateau. The 2 men on foot stopped dead. Their faces went pale. One of them turned to run. Coulter, Lila, and Tamsin spurred their horses directly into the side of the stampede. They were instantly swallowed, their 3 horses becoming part of the larger, terrified herd. Chaos. The air was unbreathable. A solid cloud of red dust and the hot, rank smell of cattle. The noise was a physical weight, a deafening roar of bellows and thundering hooves. The hunters on the ridge were shouting, but their voices were lost. The men on foot were overrun. One was thrown aside like a rag doll, his leg crushed. The other managed to dive into a crevice. The stampede, with Coulter's party hidden inside it, poured off the plateau and back down into the riverbed, thundering directly at the hunters' horses. "This way!" Tamsin shrieked, her voice thin in the chaos. Coulter knew this path. Before the main herd went straight, he grabbed Lila's bridle and veered hard left. Tamsin right behind him. They were peeling away from the stampede, aiming for a deep, dark scar in the canyon wall. It was a gully, a storm washout, its sides steep and slick with mud. "Hang on," Coulter yelled. There was no time to be gentle. He spurred his horse over the edge. They didn't ride down. They slid. Lila screamed as Steady's legs went out from under her. They plummeted 10 feet in a cascade of mud, water, and loose rock. They landed with a bone-jarring splash in 3 feet of icy, churning water at the bottom of the wash. Coulter and Tamsin landed seconds later. They were soaked, they were freezing, they were covered in filth, and they were alive. The thunder of the stampede faded above them, moving down the main canyon. They were hidden. For a moment, they just sat there, gasping, the cold water swirling around their horses' chests. Then Tamsin held up a hand. Listen. Above them, on the trail they had just left, came the sound of a single horse, moving fast. One of the hunters from the ridge. He hadn't been caught. He was smart, looping back, and he'd seen them split off. He'll be on this trail in 30 seconds. Tamsin panted, her face grim. She reached into her saddlebag, her arm disappearing to the elbow. She grunted, pulling out a heavy, canvas-wrapped object. She unrolled it. Railroad spikes, a dozen of them, heavy, rusted, and sharp. Where'd you get those? Coulter asked, stunned. Souvenirs, Tamsin said, her face dark. From the old spur line Pike tore up last year. With a grunt, she slid off her horse into the water, scrambled back up the muddy bank, and disappeared. Lila heard her grunting, hammering the spikes into the mud with a rock, point up, in the middle of the trail. She slid back down, coated in mud. Just as the horse came into hearing range, they waited, holding their breath. They heard the horse's panicked, high-pitched whinny. It was a terrible, tearing sound. It was followed by a man's scream, a heavy, wet thud, and then silence. Lila looked at Tamsin, her face pale. He's not gone, Tamsin said, her voice flat, shaking the water from her hat. But his horses, that'll slow him. She reloaded her revolver. We need to move. They urged their trembling, exhausted horses down the gully, which twisted and turned for a quarter-mile before opening up into a dark, thick grove of pines. They were in the trees, safe. The air was dark, and the ground was soft with pine needles. For the first time, they were out of sight, and, in the new quiet, they heard it, faint but unmistakable. The chuff, chuff, chuff of a steam engine, and the high, mournful wail of a train whistle. The railroad. It was close. We can't go to Ephraim Cole's office, Tamsin said, stating the obvious. She was shivering, wringing water from her hair. Vane will have it watched. The scarred man, the rest of them, they'll be there. They'll be waiting for us. Coulter nodded, his face grim. He'll expect us to go to the law. He'll have the courthouse locked down. Lila, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, looked at the oilskin pouch. The book felt warm now, like the only warm thing left. You said the jury would be bought. Tamsin, Lila said, her voice small. You said the town's opinion was the problem. It is, Tamsin said. They only know what Pike pays them to know. Then we change it, Lila said, a new hard edge in her voice. We don't need a lawyer, not yet. This book, she pulled it out. The oilskin had kept it dry. This is just names and numbers. It needs a voice. We don't need a courthouse. We need a printer. Coulter and Tamsin stared at her. The idea settled between them, dangerous and brilliant. A slow smile spread across Coulter's face. Old Bram, he said. Tamsin's head snapped up. Bram's print shop, the Copperfinch Chronicle. Her smile matched his. It's perfect. It's on the edge of town, by the lumber yard. He's an old fire eater. He hates Pike more than Cole does. He'll do it. He'll print it. Then that's where we go. Coulter said, we go around. They rode to the edge of the woods. The town of Copperfinch Crossing lay below them, a mile distant. Between them and the first buildings was a wide, open, fallow field. The last, most dangerous stretch. No cover. Lila pulled steady to a halt. She stared at the open ground. It looked like a death sentence. Coulter saw the hesitation. He moved his gelding alongside her, so close their knees brushed. He didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort. He just reached across the small space between them, his muddy glove covering her hand, the one clutching the reins. His grip was firm, unyielding. It wasn't a caress. It was an anchor. It was a promise. Together, he said. his voice a low gravel. Lila looked from his hand to his face. She saw the exhaustion, the pain, the cold resolve that matched her own. She took a shuddering breath and nodded, her own fingers gripping the reins tighter. Together. He released her hand. Tamsin? Coulter called, looking ahead. Set the pace. Tamsin kicked her horse, and the three of them burst from the cover of the trees. A desperate, muddy charge across the open field. They didn't charge the town. They skirted it. Tamsin led them on a wide, looping path, using the low ground, the drainage ditches, and the overgrown alleys behind the lumber yard. Every step was a risk. A dog barking, a curtain twitching, a man stepping out of a privy at the wrong moment. Any of it could end them. By the time they reached the back end of the market street, the sun was high and unforgiving. The horses were lathered, not from speed, but from tension. We can't go to Bram's now, Tamsin said, her voice a low rasp. They were huddled in the narrow gap between the tannery and the feed store, an alley that stank of lye and rotting hides. The Chronicle's office is on a main thoroughfare. Vane will have it watched. He'll have every entry point to this town watched. Coulter scanned the rooftops. He'll be watching for 3 riders, a man, 2 women. We need to be ghosts. Tamsin agreed. We need to get off these horses. We need a hole to crawl into until dark. I know a place, Coulter said, his eyes fixed on the back door of the building across the alley. Mavis Kilns. Tamsin's eyebrows shot up. Mavis, she's tougher than boot leather, Coulter said, and she hates Pike. His freight contracts nearly put her out of business last year. He slid off his horse, his boots hitting the muck. Stay here. Keep the horses quiet. Lila watched him move. He didn't knock. He walked to the heavy back door of Mavis Kiln's flower feed, lifted the latch, and disappeared inside. A moment later, the door opened wider. He nodded. Come! Tamsin led the horses, their hooves muffled in the refuse of the alley. They slipped inside, one by one, into the sudden, dusty dark. The world of sunlight and rifles was replaced by the cool, powdery scent of milled flour, dried beans, and burlap. A woman was standing by a stack of cornmeal sacks, a rolled barrel stave in her hand. She was in her late 50s, her hair pulled back in a severe, gray-flecked bun. Her face was a map of hard decisions. This was Mavis Kiln. She looked at Tamsin, then at Lila, soaked, muddy, and shaking. She looked at the raw, angry scratch on Lila's face. Then she looked at Coulter. Coulter Hayes, she said, her voice dry as corn husks. You look like you've been dragged backward through a gully, and you're tracking mud on my good floor. Apologies, Mavis. Coulter said, We need a place, just till dark. I see that, Mavis said, her sharp eyes taking in Lila's torn hem and the way she clutched the oilskin pouch to her chest. Is this about the commotion I heard out north, the one that had Vane and his hounds storming into the judge's chambers like they owned the place? It is, Tamsin said, stepping forward. We can't be seen. Mavis stared at Lila for a long, appraising moment. Well, she said, finally, you're not a fugitive if no one sees you. She gestured with the stave toward a second, smaller door hidden behind a rack of horse collars. The old cornmeal shed. It's warm. The chimney from my bake oven runs along the back wall. Get in there. All of you. Horses, too. It's got a back stall. The shed was small, but it was paradise. It was warm, dry, and filled with the gentle, nutty aroma of the meal. A single, dusty window let in a sliver of light. Don't move, Mavis ordered. Don't talk loud. I've got customers. She shut the door, and they were plunged into a comfortable, dusty twilight. They stood there for a minute, the silence deafening after the chaos of the ride. Lila finally let her shoulders slump, a shuddering breath escaping her. The door opened again. Mavis returned. She wasn't empty-handed. She carried a stack of clean, dry towels, a tin basin of steaming water, and a small, rough bar of lye soap. Clean up, she said. You smell like a flooded creek. She left and returned again, this time with a loaf of dark bread. a wedge of cheese, and a cast-iron skillet filled with a mound of golden, steaming cornbread. Lila, who hadn't realized she was starving, felt tears spring to her eyes. She sat on a sack of feed and ate, the hot, sweet, grainy bread tasting like life itself. Mavis watched her. She clicked her tongue, then disappeared, returning with a thick, brown wool sweater. "Your clothes are soaked," she said, pushing it at Lila. "You'll catch your death. Put this on." Tss. Lila changed, huddling in the corner, her back to the men. The dry wool was warm, smelling faintly of cedar and wood smoke. It was too large, the sleeves rolled up, but it felt like armor. When she turned, Mavis was looking at Coulter, a strange, appraising look in her eye. "It's been a long time since you brought a guest, Coulter." Coulter just grunted, his face uncomfortable, and focused on checking his saddle. The gully slide had been rough. One of his stirrup leathers was badly frayed. Lila, warm and fed, felt a flicker of energy return. She watched him fumbling with the stiff, wet leather, his fingers thick and clumsy. His shoulder, the one he'd bruised in the stampede, was clearly paining him. "Here," she said, stepping forward. "Let me." Coulter looked up, surprised. He stopped. Lila, her hands small but her fingers nimble from years of clerical work, began to work the knot. The shed was quiet. Tamsin was at the door, peering through a crack into the alley. Lila's fingers brushed the back of Coulter's hand. It was a jolt, like static electricity. Both of them pulled back, as if stung. The air, which had been comfortable, was suddenly tight, charged with an unspoken, awkward awareness. Lila looked down, her face flushing. "Sorry, Coulter cleared his throat, staring at the saddle as if it held the secrets of the universe. "It's fine." A small, absurd bubble of laughter rose in Lila's throat. Here they were, hiding from killers, covered in mud, and they were acting like schoolchildren at a dance. A breathless, half-hysterical laugh escaped her. Coulter looked at her, startled, and then, a miracle. The hard, grim lines of his mouth softened. A sound, rusty and unused, rumbled in his chest. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh, but it was real. The tension vanished, replaced by a fragile, shared understanding. "Right," Coulter said, turning back to the saddle. But the set of his shoulders was different, less rigid. Tamsin let the door flap fall. "I can't stay. Vane will have the whole town looking. Bram's will be watched, but I need to know how. And Bram, he'll need ink. Good, black ink, and plenty of it. If he's going to do what I think you want him to do, he's always running low." She looked at Coulter. "I'll go to the market, buy the ink, some paper, scout the route to Bram's. I'll meet you at his back door, 8 o'clock, after the saloon has its dinner rush, and before the real drinking starts. Don't be late." "Be careful, Tamsin," Coulter said. "I'm always careful." "Coulter," she replied, and slipped out the door, a ghost in the midday bustle. Now, they were truly alone. The shed was quiet again, but the silence was different. It was softer. Outside, a light rain began to fall, the first drops tapping on the tin roof like dried beans. The sound isolated them, cocooning them in the warm, dusty dark. Lila sat on a burlap sack, her hands wrapped around her knees. Coulter leaned against the wall, methodically cleaning his rifle. "Why do you stay?" Lila asked, her voice quiet. "This ranch, it's so alone." Coulter didn't look up from his work. His hands, steady, oiled a rag and began to rub down the barrel. "This land, it's honest. It doesn't lie. It tries to kill you in winter and bake you in summer, but it never lies about it." He paused, his hands stilling. "My wife, Mary, she loved the view from the porch. After she was gone, I hated it. I hated the silence, hated the creek that brought the fever." He squinted, as if seeing it. "The flood took out half my fencing. I spent all of spring rebuilding it. The work makes sense. You build a fence, it stands. The land doesn't care about you, but it responds. You put in the work, it gives you a boundary. It's real." Lila nodded. She understood. The numbers, she said. That's how I felt about the numbers. They were always true. A column adds up, or it doesn't. It doesn't lie. She smiled, a small, sad gesture. Back at the station there were men, teamsters, old prospectors. They'd get letters from home, or need to send money. They couldn't read or write. She looked at her hands. I'd write for them, on my own time, read their letters to them, write their replies. I got good at copying things, at keeping secrets. It felt real, like your fence. She was still holding the oilskin pouch, turning it over in her hands. The dampness from the gully had seeped in, just enough to make the leather feel supple. She traced the red ribbon, her fingers catching on a loose edge of the leather cover. Near the spine, it wasn't just a crease, it felt thick. Coulter, she said, her voice sharpening. She worked her fingernail into the gap. It wasn't just the cover. It was a page, 2 pages, stuck fast with what felt like old, flour-based paste. The dampness had weakened it, with a delicate, tearing sound. The pages separated. It wasn't writing, it was a map. Hand-drawn, in pale blue ink, the lines precise, the script beautiful. It was a detailed survey of the Bitterroot Fork, showing the river, the creeks, the homesteads. But the lines were wrong. Or, rather, they were different from the official map she had seen Vane file. Coulter, look, she breathed. He was by her side in an instant. Taking the book, he stared at the map, his brow furrowed. This is the real survey. Look at the water rights. It gives all the creek access to the homesteads, not the railroad. Then, he pointed. There, hold it to the window. Lila held the fragile page up to the grimy light, and she saw it, faint, pressed into the very fiber of the paper, was a watermark, the official, circular seal of the Territorial Survey Office. My God, Lila whispered. This is the original. The one Vane's men must have stolen from the county clerk. The one they lost. They didn't lose it, Coulter said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. They hid it. Right here, in the book, they were so desperate to get back, they pasted it in, thinking no one would ever find it. This Lila, this isn't just a payroll. This is the whole crime. This proves their entire line is built on a forgery. The door opened, making them both jump. It was Mavis, her face grim. She was carrying a small, steaming tin pot. She saw the map, the stark, pale look on their faces. She just nodded. Trouble's getting deeper. I see. I thought so. She poured a dark, fragrant tea into a mug. Pine bark tea, she said, handing it to Lila. My grandmother taught me. Good for a frayed throat, especially good to help you get your voice back, after you've been silent too long. Lila took it, the warmth and the strange, resinous taste steadying her. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady drumming that blurred the window. Mavis fussed, complaining that the latch on her front shop door was sticking in the damp. Coulter, needing to move, to do something, stood up. I can fix it, he said. He picked up a small tool roll from his saddlebag. Don't you dare go out front. Mavis snapped. I won't. I'll go through your kitchen. No one will see me. He left. Lila was alone with Mavis. The older woman was quiet, watching her. Lila looked down at Coulter's coat, tossed over a sack. The hem was torn. Flapping, a casualty of the slide. Without a word, Lila went to Mavis. Do you have a sewing basket? Mavis nodded, pointing. Lila sat, threaded a needle, and began to sew. The simple, domestic act, the in and out of the needle, the small, neat stitches. It was a prayer. It was her, repairing him. The shed was warm, the rain drummed. For one long, impossible moment, there was peace. She was just finishing when Coulter came back, shaking the rain from his hat. It's done, he said to Mavis. The catch was warped. I filed it down. Good as new. Mavis came over and patted his arm, a rare gesture of affection. You're a good man, Coulter Hayes. Mary always said you could fix anything that was broken. Coulter's face softened. A sudden, surprising transformation. He gave Mavis a small, genuine smile. "I try, Mavis, I try." Lila, watching from the corner, felt her heart give a strange, painful lurch. She had never seen him smile. It wiped away the grief and the hardness, just for a second, and showed her the man he had been. It was devastating. The moment of peace shattered. Mavis, who had gone to the front shop, came back fast, her face like stone. "Damn it," she hissed. Coulter was by her side in an instant, his rifle in his hand. "What?" "That scarred man, the one Tamsin mentioned, the one with the P on his wrist. He's at the saloon. He's not drinking. He's just standing on the porch, watching the street. And there's another one, a man in a bowler hat down by the telegraph office. Vane has the town's main arteries choked." The front door chimed. A customer. Mavis smoothed her apron, her face becoming a placid mask. "Stay here." She left. A few minutes later, Tamsin slipped back in, her face pale, rain dripping from her hat. "It's bad," she whispered. "It's worse than I thought. They're not just watching, they're checking. They're at the livery, asking questions about stray horses. They're at the hotel, asking about strangers. They know you're not at the ranch. They know you're in town." They were trapped. The 8 o'clock plan was smoke. Lila looked at the map, then at the journal. "We can't," she said. "We can't risk both, not together." She looked at Mavis, who had returned. "Mavis, do you have tracing paper from your dress patterns?" Mavis's eyes widened. "I do. Tamsin," Lila said, her voice suddenly, startlingly firm. "You're the law. You're the only one who can move around with any authority. You take a copy. You trace this map. Now. You take the copy to Ephraim Cole. You tell him to be ready." "No," Coulter said, shaking his head. "It's too dangerous." "What about you and the real book?" Lila looked at him, her eyes holding his. "Me and you, we still go to Bram's, but not at 8. We go after dark, late dark, midnight. When they think the town is asleep, they'll be watching for 3. They won't be watching for 2, and they won't be watching for a ghost." It was a new plan, born of desperation. "You're splitting the risk," Tamsin said, a grim admiration in her voice. "And doubling the targets." "We're doubling our chances," Lila said, pulling the pins from her hair, her hands suddenly steady. "Mavis, get me that paper." The air in old Bram's print shop was thick with the metallic, acidic smell of ink and hot lead. It was past midnight. Outside, Copperfinch Crossing was a ghost town. Its muddy streets empty, its windows dark, all except for the saloon, and all except for here. The Chronicle's office was a single, cavernous room. In the center, the massive, iron flatbed press stood like a sleeping beast. But tonight, it was awake. The entire shop was vibrating. The press's flywheel, driven by a steam-powered belt in the back room, was turning. Clack-thump, clack-thump, clack-thump. The sound was a heartbeat, a rhythm of rebellion in the quiet dark. Lila stood under the glare of a single gas lamp, her face pale, smudged with ink. The leather journal was open in her hands. Beside her stood old Bram, a man in his 60s with a wild shock of white hair and a printer's apron so stained it looked like a map of old news. He was working fast, his hands a blur. "Next," Bram growled. Not looking up, he held a composing stick, a small metal tray, in his left hand, his right flying across the open drawers of his typecase. Lila bent closer to the light, tracing the line in her ledger. "Jonas Mead, pasture guard, paid $40, April 10th. Mead," Bram muttered. Clack, clack, clack. He snatched the tiny, backward-facing lead letters from their compartments. "I know that name. A hired gun from the territory. $40. Got it. Next." Silas Vane. Expense voucher. $100. April 12th. The day the Miller barn burned. "Vane," Bram spat, his hand moving faster. $100. The devil pays well. Clack, clack. "Next." Lila read, and Bram built. He was setting the type by hand, letter by letter, locking the lines of text into a heavy iron frame called a chase. It was slow, meticulous, agonizing work. Every name she read was a nail in Pike's coffin. Every letter he set was a tap of the hammer. Coulter was not with them. He stood by the front door, a dark shadow in the unlit storefront. His rifle was in his hand, held easy, barrel down. He wasn't watching the room, he was watching the street. The shop was on the edge of the main square. Across the way, the Copper Queen Saloon was still blazing with light. Coulter watched the swing doors. His eyes narrowed. He was a rancher, used to watching for the flick of a coyote's ear a half-mile off. This was no different. He saw him. The saloon doors pushed open, and a man stepped onto the boardwalk. He was a mountain, broad-shouldered, in an expensive city coat, even from 50 yards. Coulter recognized the arrogant tilt of the head. Bartholomew Pike. Pike wasn't drinking. He was working. He clapped the saloon owner on the shoulder, a gesture too friendly, too proprietary. Then another man joined them, a thin, nervous man in a string tie, the postmaster. Pike shook his hand, holding it a moment too long, buying silence, securing loyalty. Coulter felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. They were printing the truth, while Pike was buying the town, block by block. A new figure emerged from the saloon, Silas Vane. He handed Pike a stack of freshly printed papers. Pike nodded, and Vane, with the scarred man at his side, began walking toward the town's central message board. "Coulter!" Lila's voice called, pulling him from the street. He turned. Bram was sliding the heavy, locked chase onto the bed of the press. He was sweating, despite the night chill. "The headline," Bram said, looking at Lila. "It needs to be yours. Girl, what does it say?" Lila looked at the journal, at the names, at the fake map and the stolen water. She thought of the burned barns and the ruined families. "It says," she said, her voice clear and cold, "the phantom payroll and the counterfeit line at Bitterroot Fork." Bram grinned, a fierce, wolfish expression. He turned back to the largest type case, grabbing the 3-inch-high wooden letters. "By God, that'll do. That'll do just fine." As Bram worked, Coulter returned to the door, and he saw them. Vane and his man were at the message board, nailing up the new posters. The light from the saloon was just bright enough for Coulter to see the bold letters "Reward." He didn't need to read the rest. A soft, rhythmic tapping came from the back door. By the alley, tap, tap, tap. Coulter moved, rifle up. "It's her," he said. He unlocked the heavy bar. Tamsin Doyle slipped in. A gust of cold, wet air coming with her. She was soaked. She pulled off her hat, her face pale and furious. "Trouble," she said, her voice low. "I got the map to Ephraim Cole. He was shaken. He believes us." "Good," Bram said, not turning. "The law's with us." "The law," Tamsin said bitterly, "is scared. Cole sent a wire to the county prosecutor. He just got a wire back. The prosecutor, he's hesitant. He wants to form a committee to review the allegations. He says Mr. Pike is a significant benefactor for the governor's re-election campaign." The clack thump of the press was the only sound. "He's stalling," Lila whispered, the blood draining from her face. "He's not going to help." "He's giving Pike time," Tamsin corrected. "And Pike is using it. He's posted a reward. Lila Merrick. $500 for theft and conspiracy against the railroad. Every gun-happy drifter and desperate man in this town will be hunting you by sunup." The hope that had been building in the room, warm and bright as the gas lamp, suddenly guttered. Old Bram locked the headline in place. He picked up a heavy ink roller, charged it with thick, black ink, and ran it over the surface of the type, the letters glistening. "A committee," Bram said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Tamsin, his eyes blazing. "The governor, politicians." He spat on the floor. "They all answer to someone. Pike answers to his money. The prosecutor answers to Pike. But I, Madam Deputy, answer to this." He slapped the iron bed of the press. "To hell with the prosecutor. To hell with the governor." We print. I'll take this ink and this truth, and I'll paper the walls of the church. I'll hand a copy to every man, woman, and child at the market. Let's see Pike stand against the light. He laid a sheet of newsprint on the type. Coulter, the handle. Coulter put down his rifle and grabbed the large iron lever that engaged the press. He pulled. The machine groaned. The heavy top plate slid across, pressing the paper to the ink. He pushed the lever back. Bram grabbed the sheet, snapping it off the type. He held it up. The ink was dark, stark, and beautiful. The phantom payroll and the counterfeit line at Bitterroot Fork. Now, Bram said, his voice vibrating with a holy fury. We make 1,000. But there was one last thing. Tamsin, Bram said, you're the law. This is just a story unless it's an affidavit, a sworn statement. He pulled a clean sheet of paper. I need her to sign it, and I need you to witness it. Lila looked at the paper. This was the true line. Once she signed this, there was no more Lila Merrick. There was only Eliana Vance, the accuser. They'll hang me, she whispered, not from fear, but from certainty. They'll try, Tamsin said. Lila took the pen. Her hand, so steady when tracing maps or sewing hems, was shaking violently. She couldn't hold it. The ink blobbed on the paper. I can't. Coulter stepped up beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her face or her shoulder. He simply placed his large, calloused, steady hand over the back of hers. His hand was warm, grounding. He didn't guide the pen. He just held her. He lent her his stillness. Lila took a ragged breath. She felt the steadiness flow from his hand into hers. The shaking stopped. She dipped the pen. In clear, precise script, she signed her name. Eliana Vance, witnessed. Tamsin Doyle, deputy. Bram nodded, his face grim. He took the signature, and in a flurry of motion, locked it into a small open space at the bottom of the article. They began to print. Just then, Coulter, his senses still on the street, froze. Light, he hissed. He moved to the front window. Down the street, telegraph office. A single, rhythmic flicker. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. It's the operator, Tamsin said, her face going pale. He's one of Pike's. He must have seen the lights, seen us move. He's wiring Pike. He's telling him we're here. The clack thump of the press was no longer a heartbeat. It was a countdown. We have to go, Coulter said, grabbing his rifle. Bram, how many do you have? 50. Bram growled. Not enough. I need 500. 50 is enough to start the fire, Tamsin said. She grabbed half the stack. The ink's still wet. Give me the rest when they're done. I'm not going to the church in the morning. I'm going now. Tamsin, it's suicide, Coulter said. No, Tamsin said, her eyes hard. It's a distraction. You two, you're the targets. You need to vanish. She looked at Lila. Pastor Galen Rye. He's a good man. His church is a sanctuary. I'm going to find him, and I'm going to make him read this at dawn. Pike can't arrest the whole town. She looked at Coulter. Get her out of here. Don't use the streets. She ran to the back door, the stack of papers under her coat. And Coulter survived this. Bram's going to need help delivering the rest. She was gone. The roof, Bram said, not stopping the press. Back window. It leads to the tanner's roof. Go, now. I'll bar the door behind you. Coulter grabbed Lila's hand. This way. He led her to the back, past the steaming, chuffing engine, to a small, grimy window. He smashed the lock with the butt of his rifle and pushed it open. Cold. Wet air flooded the room. Go, he said. Lila climbed out, her boots finding purchase on the slick, gravel tar roof. Coulter was right behind her, pulling the windows shut. They were in the dark. The rain had stopped, but the roofs were slick, glistening in the faint moonlight. The town was spread out below them, a maze of dark, geometric shapes. Stay low, move fast, Coulter whispered. They ran, side by side, their boots making soft, sliding sounds on the wet shingles. They were exposed, outlined against the sky, but it was their only path. They leaped a narrow, dark gap, landing on the lower roof of the feed store. They were almost clear. The alley behind Mavis's was just one roof away. "This last one," Coulter said, pointing. "It's steep. Be careful." He went first, moving with a rancher's easy balance. He got to the far edge, where a ladder led down. He turned, holding out a hand. Lila followed. She was halfway down the slick pitch of the roof when her foot, clad in Mary's worn-out boot, slipped on a patch of wet moss. She didn't have time to cry out. She just fell. Coulter moved with the speed of a striking snake. He didn't reach. He lunged, his arm, hard as iron, hooked around her waist. He pulled, his own body taking the jarring force of her fall. He stumbled back, but held her. Lila was slammed flush against his chest, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat. They froze. For one long, agonizing second, the world stopped. There were no killers. There was no printing press. There was no pursuit. There was only the slick, dark roof and the cold night air. Lila could feel the solid, hammering beat of his heart against her cheek. She could feel the unyielding strength in the arm locked around her waist, holding her, pinning her to him. She smelled the rain on his coat, the faint traces of gunpowder, and the clean, cold scent of the man himself. She looked up. He was looking down. His face was inches from hers. Their breath mingled, a single white cloud in the dark. The line was gone. The careful boundary they had built fugitive and protector, rancher and stranger, it had just been erased. He was holding her, and she was letting him. It was a raw, silent, terrifying acknowledgement. Lila's hands, which had been flailing, came to rest on his chest. His grip on her waist, which had been a reflex, did not loosen. He didn't move. She didn't speak. It was a question, an answer, and a promise, all in one long, shared breath. A shout, far below, in the street. "Up there I saw him on the roof." The moment shattered. Coulter released her, but his hand stayed on her arm. "Lud, we have to go." He pulled her toward the ladder, and they plunged back into the darkness. But they were no longer two strangers. They were a we. They didn't go down the ladder. They fell. The shout from the street, "On the roof," was followed by the flat, deadly crack of a rifle shot. The bullet didn't hit them. It hit the tin gutter by the ladder, exploding with a sound like a struck bell. "This way!" Coulter yelled. He didn't go for the ladder. He grabbed Lila's hand and ran in the other direction, pulling her toward the back of the building, toward the dark abyss of the alley. They didn't climb. They jumped. It was a 12-foot drop, but a mound of discarded leather scraps from the tannery, piled high, broke their fall. They landed hard, in a heap. The breath knocked from Lila's lungs. The stench of lye and curing chemicals was overwhelming. "Move! Lila, move!" Coulter hauled her to her feet. Another shot. A man was on the roof now, silhouetted against the moon, trying to get a clear line of sight. They ran. They didn't go for Mavis's. They didn't go for the horses. Vane's men were everywhere, their shouts echoing in the narrow, canyon-like streets. Coulter knew Copperfinch Crossing. He also knew its weaknesses. He pulled her through a gap in a fence, across a sleeping livery yard, the horses snorting an alarm, and into the dry creek bed that cut behind the town. It was the same one they'd used earlier, Larkspur Bend, and the rain, which had held off, returned. Not a drizzle, not a shower. It was a deluge, a cold, furious mid-autumn storm that turned the dry wash into a shallow, churning river in minutes. "Where are we going?" Lila gasped, stumbling over the slick rocks, the icy water soaking her to the knees. "Out!" Coulter panted, his hand locked on her arm, pulling her forward. "We can't fight them in town. It's their ground. We go back to mine." They ran for what felt like an hour, the rain lashing them, the thunder rolling overhead. They were running on pure, frantic adrenaline, but the cold and the exhaustion were catching up. Lila's steps faltered. She was shaking, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. "Just a little more," Coulter urged, his voice harsh against the wind. "There." He pulled her off the main wash, up a steep bank. and into a thick stand of willows. Hidden inside, so overgrown it looked like a pile of rotted logs, was a small, dark shape, a line rider's shack. Coulter put his shoulder to the warped door and shoved. It flew open with a groan. He pushed her inside, into the absolute, musty dark. He followed, slamming the door and dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. The sound of the bar sliding home was the loudest thing Lila had ever heard. It was the sound of the world being shut out. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the roar of the rain on the tin roof and the sound of their own ragged, tearing breaths. Then Coulter moved. She heard a scrape, the sharp, sulphurous smell of a match. Light flared. He was kneeling by a small, rusted potbelly stove, his face illuminated from below. He touched the match to a pile of dry kindling and pine cones, clearly stashed there for this exact purpose. The fire caught, a small, hungry flame. He fed it larger sticks, his movements economical. Sure, the stove began to tick, tick, as the metal heated, and a small, blessed circle of warmth began to push back the damp. He stood, pulling off his soaking duster and hanging it from a peg, where it dripped heavily onto the packed earth floor. He looked at her. Lila was standing by the door, shaking. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the adrenaline crash. It was the rooftop, the jump, the run, the terror. It was the memory of his arm around her waist, the solid, unyielding reality of him, the only thing that had kept her from falling. "Your cloak," he said, his voice quiet. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers numb. He saw her struggling and stepped forward. He didn't ask. His hands, large and rough, brushed hers aside and undid the knot. He took the heavy, sodden wool from her shoulders and hung it next to his. She was left in Mavis's sweater, which was also damp, her trousers soaked through. The shiver wasn't just a shiver. It was a bone-deep tremor that shook her entire frame. Coulter turned, finding a battered tin pot. He went to the door, opened it a crack, and scooped a pot full of clean rain from the roof runnel barrel. He set it on the stove to heat. He was still wearing his heavy riding gloves. They were stiff, dark with water. He pulled them off, one finger at a time, his movements slow. His bare hands were scarred, the knuckles cracked, the palms calloused. He waited for the water to warm, the silence drawing out. Lila wrapped her arms around herself, moving closer to the fire. He poured the steaming water into a single tin mug. He held it out to her. "It's not tea, but it's hot." Lila reached for it, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. He steadied her, his fingers closing over hers, wrapping them around the hot tin. As he did, his thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, where the sleeve of the sweater had pulled back. He stopped. His eyes, dark in the firelight, dropped from her face to her wrist. He wasn't looking at the scratches from the gully. He was looking at a single, pale, thin white line, an old scar, almost invisible, that ran parallel to her veins. He didn't speak. He just held her gaze, his thumb resting gently on the scar. His look was quiet, penetrating. It held no judgment. It just asked, "Does it hurt?" Lila's breath hitched. She tried to pull her hand away, a sudden, sharp reflex of shame. But he didn't let go. He just held her, his grip gentle but firm, until her eyes met his again. She pulled her hand from his, taking the mug. She turned away, moving to lean against a rough-hewn wooden post that supported the roof. The warmth of the stove was at her back. "It's from a long time ago," she whispered, her voice rough. "Before, when I first found the ledgers, when I realized what I was seeing." He said nothing. He just waited. He was a patient man. Coulter Hayes. He could wait out a blizzard. He could wait out her silence. "I thought about," she started, and stopped. She took a shuddering breath. "I thought about how easy it would be to just stop, to not have to know, to not have to carry it." She traced the rough grain of the wood with her fingernail. "My whole life," she whispered, "I believed in things, in right and wrong, in the truth of numbers. When I saw what they were doing, the fires, the accidents, all in veins perfect, balanced columns. It was like the floor of the world fell away. It wasn't the fear of them catching me. Not at first. She turned, her eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. My deepest, most terrible fear was being forced to be silent. It was the thought of having to go back to that desk, every day, and see Mr. Vane smile, and know the truth and have to live as if I didn't, as if it never happened, as if those families, those lives were just numbers. That's the real end of the world. Coulter, not the running, the silence. Her confession hung in the small, warm room. It was the truest thing she had ever said. Coulter watched her. He saw the woman who had signed her name to that affidavit, the woman who had run across a rooftop in the dark, the woman who had slipped, and the woman who was now trembling by his fire. The last wall in him, the one he had built of ice and solitude over Mary's grave, didn't just crack, it dissolved. He took one step, crossing the small space, then another. He stopped, just inches from her, close enough to feel the heat coming off her, close enough to see the exhaustion in her eyes. He didn't have the words to answer her. He wasn't a man of words. He was a man of fences, of action, of quiet, solid things. He just waited. He let his eyes ask the question. He gave her the choice. He held his hand out, palm up, not to take anything, but to offer. Let me. Lila looked at his hand, scarred and strong. She looked at his face, his gaze steady and clear. The terror of the night, the crushing loneliness of the run, the impossible, aching need to just rest. It all welled up in her. She didn't take his hand. She gave a single, tiny nod, a closing of her eyes, a breath that was almost a sob. It was all the permission he needed. The last few inches of distance disappeared. He didn't grab her, he gathered her. His arms came around her, one hand spreading wide across her back, the other settling at the base of her neck. He pulled her against his chest, tucking her head under his chin. It wasn't the desperate, saving clutch from the roof. This was slow, deliberate. It was a hug of pure, uncomplicated shelter. He was solid. He was warm. He smelled of pine smoke and wet wool and safety. Lila's hands, which had been clenched at her sides, slowly uncurled. She slid them up his chest, gripping the rough fabric of his shirt. She buried her face against him, and for the first time in a month, she let go. She let the shaking come, and she let him hold her. They just stood there, in the middle of the small, warm room. The rain drummed on the roof. The stove ticked. He held her, and she held him. It was a long, quiet, healing embrace. He felt the tremors in her body slowly subside. He felt the tension drain out of her, replaced by a simple, heavy weight as she leaned against him. He eased his hold, just enough to look down at her. His hand moved from her back to cup her jaw. She tilted her head back, her eyes meeting his. The kiss came slowly. It wasn't a collision. It was a discovery. It was hesitant, a question, just the brush of his lips against hers, dry and warm from the fire. It was the scent of the storm, and the taste of solace. Lila's lips parted on a trembling breath. She answered. It deepened. It wasn't a kiss of passion. Not yet. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, starving trust. It was two heartbeats, frantic and alone, finding each other in the dark and, for the first time, stumbling into the same rhythm. When it broke, they didn't move apart. They rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air. His hand, the one that had held her, began to move. His thumb, calloused and rough, brushed the line of her jaw, wiping away a tear she hadn't known had fallen. His other hand moved up, his fingers tangling gently in the damp hair at the nape of her neck. Lila's hands, no longer gripping his shirt, entwined behind his neck. A small, breathless laugh escaped her. It was a sound of pure disbelief, of having run through hell and found this. He smiled back, a real smile, the one she had seen in Mavis's shed. It reached his eyes, crinkling them at the corners. Eliana, he whispered. He used her real name. It sounded like a prayer. Coulter, She breathed. The intimacy of their names, spoken in the dark, was a vow more binding than any paper. The firelight danced on the rough wooden walls. It cast their two shadows as one, swaying, a shape that looked like the red ribbon from her journal, tied in an unbreakable knot. The rain outside became a lulling, steady rhythm. Exhaustion, deep and absolute, finally claimed them. They didn't move to the small cot in the corner. They just sank. They slid down the post, ending up on the floor, leaning against the wood. Coulter pulled his dry blanket from his saddle roll, the one he hadn't worn, and draped it over both of them. Lila leaned her head on his shoulder. His arm stayed around her. The fire died down to glowing red embers, and they slept, still half sitting, holding on to each other as if the current of the world might pull them apart. Dawn came not as a light, but as a lessening of the dark, a cold, gray promise. The rain had stopped. Lila stirred first. She was stiff, cold, and for a second, disoriented. Then she felt the solid weight of Coulter, his head resting against hers. She turned her head. Just enough. He was still asleep. The hard, wary lines of his face softened, making him look younger. She didn't think, she just acted. She leaned in, tilting her chin, and pressed her lips to his. A simple, gentle touch, a confirmation. His eyes opened. He was instantly awake, but not startled. He looked at her. The new day was here. The fight was not over. It was just beginning. But everything had changed. He didn't kiss her back. He just held her gaze, his eyes clear and steady. The choice, made in the firelit dark, held in the cold, gray light of morning. The gray, metallic light of dawn found them stiff, cold, and caked in drying mud. The intimacy of the line shack felt a lifetime away. The world had returned, and with it, the fight. They moved back toward Copperfinch Crossing, not as fugitives, but as combatants. The plan was simple, desperate, and, they hoped, unexpected. Tamsin, now in her deputy's uniform, her badge polished and pinned in plain sight, would rendezvous with Bram. They would get the full print run every last copy of the Chronicle. Coulter and Lila would meet Pastor Galen Rye at the church, as the town bell rang for the 6 o'clock morning prayers. The town was just waking up. The smell of wood smoke and coffee cut the damp air. They saw the church, its white steeple sharp against the bruised purple of the sky. But something was wrong. Pastor Rye was already outside, on the church steps, and he was nailing something to the heavy oak doors. It wasn't Lila's affidavit. Tamsin, coming from the print shop, ran to meet them, her face ashen, her breathing ragged. She was empty-handed. "It's over," she panted, her voice cracking. They were waiting for him. Vane's men? "Tamsin, where are the papers?" Coulter demanded, his good hand gripping her arm. "Gone," she said, her voice hollow. They didn't just threaten Bram. They smashed his press. Coulter, they took sledgehammers to it. It's just scrap iron. They held him down. Forced him to sign this." She pointed to the paper Pastor Rye was nailing up. It was a retraction. A small, hastily printed sheet from a backup press. It declared that the Chronicle had been the victim of a hoax, fooled by a troubled and hysterical woman, and that all allegations against Mr. Pike's railroad were false and malicious. They were waiting at dawn. Tamsin continued, her voice full of self-loathing. "Vane's hounds, the scarred man. They'd been there all night. They bought every copy Bram had managed to print, every last one. They're all gone. They won. Coulter." They were exposed, standing in the middle of the street as the first few shopkeepers began to open their doors. People were stopping, staring at the small, defeated cluster, at the muddy, wild-eyed woman, at the rancher with his arm in a sling, at the deputy, who looked, for the first time, like she had lost. A voice called out, too friendly. "Coulter Hayes. My God, man, you look like you've been rode hard and put away wet." Coulter turned. It was Jeb Lorne, another small-time rancher from the South Valley, a man Coulter had known for 10 years. A flicker of relief crossed Coulter's face. Jeb, we need help. Jeb walked toward them, his eyes shifty, his hat pulled low. He wouldn't meet Coulter's gaze. Help? Coulter, seems to me like help is the last thing you need. Seems to me you've brought a whole mess of trouble to this town. Coulter's blood went cold. Jeb, what are you talking about? I'm talking about this. Coulter, Jeb said, his hand straying to his pocket. I'm talking about Mr. Vane. He came to see me last night, made me an offer on my spring herd, a real good offer, more than they're worth. Said he just needed a small favor. He finally looked up, his eyes a miserable mix of greed and shame. He was looking at Lila. He's paying $500. Coulter, for the girl. That's 2 years' profit. I can't. I'm sorry. He had sold them. Jeb, no, Coulter said, his good hand moving. But it was too late. Jeb Lorne wasn't a gunman. He was a Judas. He yanked a small, shrill train whistle from his vest and blew. Fweet! The signal cut the morning air. It wasn't just Vane. It was an army. From the saloon, from the hotel, from the feed store alley. The scarred man, the man in the bowler hat, a dozen hired guns, mounted and ready. They poured into the street, cutting off all escape. Tamsin! Lila screamed. Tamsin had been holding a single, small stack of papers under her coat, the last 50 copies that Bram had hidden, the ones she was supposed to deliver to Ephraim Cole. They were the last copies on Earth. Vane, sitting on a fine black horse, smiled. The papers, deputy, and the girl. Go to hell, Vane, Tamsin snarled, drawing her revolver. The cattle pens, Coulter roared. Shoving Lila. To the station. But Vane's men were smarter. They didn't charge. 2 of them, led by the scarred man, broke from the group and rode, hard, straight for the railroad stockyards. They didn't stop at the gates. They fired their revolvers into the air, screaming, their bullets splintering the fence posts. The reaction was instantaneous. A deep, rumbling groan. 1,000 head of longhorn cattle, penned and ready for shipment, surged as one. The sound was not a stampede. It was an explosion. The wooden gates splintered like matchsticks. A solid, brown river of panicked. Thundering beef flooded the main street, a wall of horns and hooves that blotted out the sun. Get inside, Coulter yelled, but there was no inside. The town was a narrow channel, and the flood of cattle filled it from wall to wall. Lila was knocked from her feet, her small stack of papers flying from her grip. Scattering like autumn leaves under the thundering hooves, she fell, landing hard, directly in the path of the oncoming herd. Lila! Coulter roared. He didn't think. He reacted. He was a rancher. He knew cattle. He ran at the herd, right into the face of the lead steer. He was still wearing the blanket from the line shack, draped over his good shoulder. He ripped it off, flapping it, screaming a high, raw-throated cry, making himself the larger, more immediate threat. He was trying to split the herd, to create a V-shaped pocket of safety. A massive, red-eyed steer, its horns 6 feet across, saw the motion and veered. It worked. The animal turned, but it was too close. Coulter threw himself sideways, shoving Lila, pushing her toward the shallow boardwalk. Get under! The steer hit him. It wasn't the point of the horn. It was the flat, solid, 1,000-pound force of its head and shoulder. The impact was a sledgehammer. It caught Coulter in his injured left arm and shoulder, picking him up and throwing him. Lila heard the sickening, wet crack of bone. Coulter flew backward, skidding through the mud and filth. He slammed into one of the thick wooden posts holding up the mercantile's awning. The post splintered. He crumpled to the ground, his arm dangling at an angle that was hideously, impossibly wrong. The world dissolved into a flash of white, agonizing light, and then nothing. Coulter! Lila's scream was swallowed by the roar. The herd was thundering past, a nightmare of hooves and bellowing. Tamsin was on the boardwalk, firing her revolver into the air, the small cracks useless against the wall of sound, trying to turn the lead animals away from the storefronts. Lila didn't hesitate. She didn't run. She crawled, on her hands and knees, in the mud, under the bellies of the terrified animals. Hooves, like pistons, missed her face by inches. She reached Coulter. He was slumped against the broken post, unconscious, his face a ghastly, bloodless gray. "Move, help me," she screamed at him, at herself, at the world. She got her shoulder under his good arm, pulling. He was a dead weight. She dragged him, half carrying, her feet slipping in the mud, into the narrow, filthy drainage ditch that ran alongside the boardwalk. It was barely a 6-inch drop, but it was below the level of the hooves. They lay flat. She threw her body over his, pressing them both into the muck as the world, a thunder of 1,000,000 pounds, roared over them. It lasted an eternity, 2 full minutes. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The last of the herd thundered out of town, leaving behind a street of pure, liquid chaos, splintered wood, overturned carts, and silence. Lila pushed herself up, shaking, covered in filth. Coulter groaned. He was alive. "My arm!" he gasped, his teeth gritted, his eyes rolling. His left arm was destroyed, the shoulder clearly shattered, the bone itself tenting the skin. Lila's hands were shaking so hard she couldn't clasp them. "Steady." She ripped a long strip of fabric from her own petticoat. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice a low, fierce hiss. She bound his arm, tight, to his chest, immobilizing it. It was a crude, brutal, and effective sling. Her knuckles were white. Tamsin ran up, her face streaked, her gun empty. He's alive," Lila said, her voice hard as iron. The street was clear. At the far end, Vane and his men were regrouping. The scarred man was dismounted, laughing. He was picking up the muddy, trampled, ruined scraps of the Chronicle. "They have them?" Lila whispered, her stomach turning. It's all for nothing." "No," Tamsin said, her eyes narrowing. "They're moving. Where are they going?" Vane's men were mounting up. They were riding, not back to the saloon, but out of town, toward the river, toward the new, skeletal, black iron structure that spanned the Bitterroot Fork. "The bridge!" Coulter gasped, spitting mud. "The railroad bridge! They're going to burn them," Tamsin said, the realization dawning. "They're going to burn the evidence. Right on Pike's own bridge. A public spectacle. A final, arrogant warning to the whole town." Lila got to her feet. She looked at the muddy, torn scraps of paper. She looked at Coulter, gray-faced and broken. She looked at the retreating riders. "No," she said. "Lila, don't." Coulter grunted, trying to push himself up with his one good arm. It's done. They don't get to win," she said. Her voice was no longer shaking. It was cold. It was the sound of a ledger, balanced and true. "They don't get to burn the truth." She started to run, not crawling, not stumbling, running, straight down the center of the ruined street. "Lila, damn it," Tamsin yelled, running after her. As Lila ran, she felt a new vibration, a low, deep rumble in the earth, different from the stampede. She looked at the river. The Bitterroot was changing. The calm, shallow water was rising. Fast. A muddy, churning, 3-foot wall of water was powering down the canyon. "My God," Tamsin said, grabbing her arm. "The upper canal. Pike's been digging a sluice gate all summer to drain the homesteaders' water. He's opened it. He's flooding the valley to wash it all away. The evidence, the town, the people. He's destroying it all." Lila didn't stop. She reached the base of the bridge. The rising water was already licking at the stone abutments. Vane's men were dismounting, walking onto the iron structure. The scarred man carrying the papers and a can of oil. Coulter stumbled up behind them, his face a mask of sweat and agony, his good hand clutching his lariat. "Lila!" he roared. He looked at the rising flood. He looked at the bridge. "Tamsin!" he yelled, his voice raw. "The town! Get the town ring, the church bell! Get everyone! This isn't about a paper anymore! He's flooding the fork! Get them down here! Get them to see!" Tamsin saw the desperate, brilliant logic. She nodded once. She turned and sprinted back toward the church, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Flood! Flood!" Pike is flooding the valley ring, the bell on Coulter, his face white, his one good hand coiling the rope. Started walking, one agonizing step at a time, toward the bridge. Lila was already on it. The bridge was a skeleton of iron beams and new wooden planks. The roar of the rising flood below was deafening. Vane's men were in the middle. The scarred man was piling the wet papers. Jeb Lorne, the betrayer, was with them, his face miserable, holding the oil can. "Jeb!" Lila screamed, her voice cutting through the roar. Jeb froze. He looked at her. "You did it." "Jeb," the scarred man sneered, "dousing the papers. You earned your money. Now, light it." He struck a match and held it out. Jeb looked at the oil. He looked at the rising water. He looked at Lila, standing 20 feet away, soaked, covered in mud, her eyes burning with a fury that dwarfed the flood. "Jeb!" she yelled, walking closer. "I read the ledgers. I saw your name. I saw your voucher from last spring." Jeb flinched. "It wasn't $500, was it?" she cried, her voice raw. "It was $30 for crop damage. That's what Pike paid you when his men accidentally stampeded your field. That's what your silence was worth." Jeb was shaking, the match burning in his hand. He said he'd make it right this time." "He's not making it right," Lila screamed. "He's buying you. He bought your silence for $30, and now he's buying your soul. Don't let him. Jeb, don't sell your voice for so little." "Light it, you fool," the scarred man growled, raising his gun. Jeb Lorne looked at the oil-soaked papers. He looked at the gun. He looked at Lila, standing fearless against the flood. I ain't worth $30, he whispered. In one violent, twisting motion, he turned. He didn't drop the match. He swung the heavy oil can. He didn't aim for Lila. He aimed for the scarred man, swinging the can like a club, knocking the man's gun hand aside. The gun fired, the bullet sparking off the iron trestle. Jeb roared, a sound of pure animal rage, and swung the can again, smashing it against the man's arm. The can burst, oil splashed. It went everywhere, over the planks, over the scarred man, over the papers. The man screamed, stumbling back, dropping the still-lit match onto his own oil-soaked boot. Whoomph! It was a flash fire. The oil-soaked wood ignited. A wall of orange flame erupted, separating Lila from the men. The bridge shuddered. The wooden planks were burning. But the iron was holding. The fire on the bridge was not a large explosion, but a localized, vicious whoomph of ignited oil. It created a wall of smoke and flame, isolating Jeb and the scarred, burning man on the far side. Below, the floodwaters roared. A brown, churning tide unleashed by Pike's own hand. The church bell began to ring. It wasn't the slow Sunday toll. It was the frantic, panicked peal Tamsin was pulling, the sound of disaster. Clang, 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 the town, already roused by the stampede, poured from its houses. They ran toward the church, and Tamsin, standing on the steps, her revolver in her hand, pointed. "The bridge Pike is flooding the valley. He's flooding us all." The crowd, a confused, angry mass of shopkeepers, ranchers, and wives, surged toward the river. They arrived just as the floodwaters hit the bridge abutments with the sound of a cannon. They saw the fire. They saw Lila, standing on the bank, covered in mud. They saw Coulter, his arm bound in a bloody sling, his face a mask of white agony, his lariat still in his good hand, ready. And they saw Bartholomew Pike, his face a mask of cold fury. Trapped between the flood and the town he had tried to silence, the law, the official law, had failed. The prosecutor was silent. The judge was bought. The press was smashed. "Bring him to the warehouse," a voice yelled. It was Mavis Kiln, her face like a thundercloud. "He can't run from all of us." The seed and grain warehouse became the courtroom. It was the only building large enough to hold the crowd and dry enough from the flood. The vast, cavernous space smelled of burlap, dried corn, and dust. A single, large loading door was open, letting in the gray, chaotic light. Pastor Galen Rye, his face grim, stood on a stack of feed sacks. "This is not a trial," he called, his voice booming over the murmur of the crowd. "This is a public inquiry. We will have order." Tamsin Doyle, her badge glinting, stood by the door. She was no longer just a deputy. She was the only law left. "We will have order," she repeated, and the crowd, seeing her, quieted. Pike was forced to the center of the room, his expensive coat mud-splattered. He was not alone. A slick, pale man in a suit stood beside him, a leather briefcase in his hand. "This is an outrage," the lawyer shouted, his voice high and thin. "This is mob rule. My client, Mr. Bartholomew Pike, is the victim here. These vagrants," he gestured at Lila and Coulter, "have incited a riot. We'll see who the vagrant is," Mavis Kiln called from the crowd. "I have here," the lawyer shouted, pulling a sheaf of papers from his briefcase. "Signed and notarized deeds, voluntary transfers of land from every homesteader in the Bitterroot Fork. This entire line is legal. Approved by the territorial magistrate." He held them aloft. This inquiry is over." "He's right," a man in the crowd muttered. "It's signed." "Is it?" Lila's voice cut through the room. It was not loud, but it was sharp, and it carried. She walked forward, mud-caked, her hair wild. She was still clutching the oilskin pouch. Coulter, leaning heavily against a post, his face beaded with sweat, watched her. "Ask him," Lila said, her voice clear, "to show you the signature of Hiram Smith." The lawyer fumbled, sorting through the papers. Yes, right here. Hiram Smith, voluntary transfer. Signed and witnessed." "Now ask him," Lila said, "to show you the signature of Jeb Lorne from last spring's crop damage voucher." The lawyer blanched. "That is not pertinent." "Isn't it?" Lila pulled the leather journal from the pouch. She was no longer a fugitive. She was an auditor. She opened it, not to the payroll, but to the map she had unpeeled. "This," she said, holding the fragile, watermarked paper high, "is the original territorial survey map of the Bitterroot Fork, the one Mr. Pike's office lost 2 years ago." A gasp went through the room. "And this," she said, flipping a page in her journal, "is the forged map he filed with the county, the one that steals the water rights from every man here." The crowd surged. "Thief!" someone yelled. "And the signatures," Lila continued, her voice rising. "I was a clerk. I saw them. They were too perfect. He didn't just get signatures. He traced them. He used a base signature and copied it over and over. Look at Hiram Smith's transfer. Now look at the forgery of the county deed. It's the same signature. Line for line. It's fraud." The lawyer was speechless. Pike's eyes were slits of ice. Coulter stepped forward, his good hand fumbling in his vest. I knew Hiram Smith," he gasped, the pain making his voice tight. "He was my friend. He was a blacksmith. He left last year, said Pike's men had run him off, that he'd been cheated." He pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. This was his last pay stub. He gave it to me. I didn't understand it then." He held it up. "It's a payroll voucher. From Pike's Railroad. For pasture guarding. But Hiram never guarded a pasture in his life. He shoed horses." Lila scanned her journal. "Hiram Smith," she said, her finger finding the line. "Entry 42, pasture guard. Serial number 908B. Coulter unfolded the stub. He read, his voice hoarse. "Serial number 908B. The crowd exploded. It was proof. The phantom payroll was real. "This is chaos," the lawyer shrieked. "This proves nothing. You have no authority." "Tamsin," a voice called. A young man, the assistant telegraph operator, was running into the warehouse, waving a piece of paper. "Tamsin, this just came from the county prosecutor." Tamsin grabbed the telegram. The room went dead silent. She read it. A slow, stunned look spread across her face. He says, in light of the civil unrest, the reports of fire and flood, She looked up, her eyes wide. "He's siding with us. All railroad lands in the Bitterroot Fork are hereby ordered sealed pending a full federal investigation." A roar went up from the crowd. It was the first time the law had ever been on their side. "It's not enough, old Bram." His apron torn, his face smudged with soot from his ruined press, pushed to the front. "That's paper that's pending. Pike will buy this prosecutor just like he bought the last. Then we show them." In them, Mavis Kiln yelled. She and Pastor Rye were moving through the crowd, handing out the last, precious, mud-stained copies of the Chronicle. The 50 copies Tamsin had saved. "Here, read the names. Read the blood money. It's all there." People grabbed the damp pages. They read. They saw their neighbors' names. They saw the dates of the fires. They saw the pasture guards. The murmur became a growl. Pike finally spoke. His voice was low, reptilian, and full of venom. "You fools," he hissed. "You think this matters? You think your mud-stained papers and your half-drowned pastor mean anything? I am this territory. I will own this valley before the snow flies. I will see this entire town burn to ash, and I will silence every last one of you." "Got it," Bram said, pulling a pencil from his ear. He scribbled on the back of a seed catalog. "Silence every last one of you." A direct quote. "Mr. Pike. For the next paper." Pike lunged at him, but 2 ranchers caught his arms. Pastor Galen Rye held up his hands. "This is not a mob. We will be better than him." He pointed to 12 men in the crowd. "Jedediah Smith, Mavis Kiln, you, Hemlock, you, Jeb Lorne." He named 12 town leaders. "You are this town's jury. What say you?" Jedediah Smith, the hardware store owner, the man Tamsin had said was deep in Pike's debt, stepped forward. His face was pale. I say, my debt be damned. I say we vote to suspend all of Pike's construction rights. Effective now." "Aye," the crowd roared. Jeb Lorne, his hands blistered from the oil can, his clothes singed, pushed through. He stood before Lila, his head bowed. He paid me," Jeb said, his voice thick with shame. $500 to betray Coulter, and she was right. He paid me $30 last year for my ruined crop. I am ashamed." He looked at Lila, his eyes full of tears. "I'm sorry." Lila looked at the broken man. She nodded, her face softening. "Redemption starts with telling the truth." Jeb. Coulter watched, his head leaning against the post. His body was on fire with pain, but his eyes were clear. He watched Lila. He saw her stand against the lawyer. He saw her face down Pike. He saw her forgive Jeb. This wasn't the terrified woman from his barn. This was a queen. And in that moment, his heart, which he had thought long dead and buried with Mary, ached with a fierce, burning, and undeniable love. The church bell, which had been silent, began to toll. Not in panic. It was the slow, measured, midday bell. It was noon. Click, clack, click, clack, the sound of the telegraph key. From the office across the street, cut through the din. The young operator ran back in, his eyes as wide as saucers. He wasn't even looking at Tamsin. He was looking at Pike. It's from the U.S. Marshal in the Capitol," he stammered. "The prosecutors wire it. It triggered a federal alert. They're sending a detail, but that's not all." He held the paper out to Tamsin, his hand shaking. "What is it?" Tamsin demanded. It's an order," the boy whispered. "Effective immediately, to detain the person of Bartholomew Pike on charges of federal mail fraud, land fraud, and incitement to riot. They're arresting him." It was over. The room exploded in a deafening cheer. Pike's lawyer just wilted, his papers scattering. Pike stood still. The mask of civilization, the veneer of the businessman, finally cracked and fell away. Underneath was the wolf. "No," he said, his voice a soft, deadly hiss. "I am not being detained." His hand moved, a blur, inside his expensive coat. Coulter saw it. "Gun!" he roared, lunging forward with his one good arm. But Pike was faster. He pulled a small, silver-plated derringer. He wasn't aiming at Tamsin. He wasn't aiming at Lila. He was aiming at the crowd, at the door. He was going to shoot his way out. Pike didn't wait. He didn't bargain. The moment the word "arresting" left the boy's lips, He was no longer a businessman. He was a cornered wolf. Coulter's gun was a warning, but Pike's action was a strategy. He didn't aim at Tamsin. He didn't aim at Lila. He aimed at the packed dirt floor, just feet in front of the crowd. The Derringer fired. It was a small, sharp, almost pathetic pop, but the effect was immediate. The crowd, which had been surging forward, recoiled in a wave of panic. They trampled each other, shoving backward to escape the gun. It was all he needed, in that single 2-second gap of chaos. Pike shoved the telegraph boy aside and bolted out the warehouse door. "He's running!" Tamsin yelled, shoving her way through the bottleneck of terrified townsfolk. But Pike wasn't just running. He was a man of assets. Outside, tied to the hitching post, was Jeb Lorne's own horse, the fastest gelding in the South Valley. Pike didn't bother with the reins. He grabbed the saddle horn, hauled himself up, and dug his heels in. The horse, terrified, leaped forward, scattering the last of the crowd. "He's heading for the bridge," Coulter roared, his face white with agony and understanding. "He's not escaping, he's finishing the job." "What job?" Lila gasped, pushing through the door beside him. "The explosives," Tamsin yelled, emerging, her own revolver now in her hand. "The construction shed. He's going to blow the bridge. He'll cut the town off, destroy the evidence, and stop the marshals." Lila's eyes swept the street. The floodwaters were already a foot deep in the main square. Pike was plowing through the new, shallow river, his horse spraying muddy water. She saw Mavis Kiln's light delivery buggy, its horse still nervously tied to a post. She didn't ask. She ran. She untied the knot, threw herself onto the seat, and grabbed the reins. "Hiya!" she screamed, slapping the reins. The small buggy horse, spooked, lunged into the flooded street. "Lila, no!" Coulter bellowed. He saw her go, a small, solitary figure in a rattling cart, chasing a desperate man. He saw his own horse, steady, huddled by the warehouse wall where Tamsin had left her. He grabbed the reins with his one good hand. He tried to mount, but the agony from his shattered left arm sent a wave of black, sickening nausea through him. He couldn't. "Jeb!" he roared. Jeb Lorne was standing in the doorway, paralyzed with shame. "Help me up now." Jeb ran, his face a mask of desperation. He half lifted, half shoved Coulter onto the saddle. Coulter cried out, a raw, ragged sound. His teeth gritted so hard they might crack. He grabbed the reins in his right hand. "He's going to kill her! Jeb!" Coulter gasped, his vision swimming. "Get Tamsin! Get the town! Follow us!" He dug his heels in, the horse leaping forward. The pursuit was a nightmare. Lila, in the light, fast buggy, bounced and skidded through the flooded street, the wheels threatening to fly off. Pike was ahead of her, a dark shape against the gray. Churning water, behind her. Coulter rode, his body swaying, barely conscious. He wasn't riding. He was willing himself to stay on the horse. His world reduced to a single point of focus, Lila's back. The rain, which had held off, returned with a vengeance. It was a cold, driving horizontal sheet of water. The world dissolved into gray. The roar of the flood was deafening. Pike reached the bridge first. He abandoned the horse, leaving it to panic at the bank. He ran onto the iron structure, his fine boots slipping. The floodwaters were no longer just licking the abutments. They were a raging brown tide, surging over the lower supports. The entire bridge was groaning, a low, metallic, tortured sound. He ran to the small, zinc-roofed shed on the far side. Dynamite. Danger. He kicked the door in. Lila abandoned the buggy, the horse rearing as the water surged around its legs. She ran onto the bridge, her boots slipping on the wet planks. She was halfway across when Coulter arrived, sliding his horse to a halt. He dismounted, falling to one knee, his good hand grabbing his lariat from the saddle. He got to his feet, staggering, his shattered arm a dead, agonizing weight. He started to walk onto the bridge. Pike emerged from the shed. He was holding a single, pale yellow stick of dynamite, its fuse long and white, in his other hand. He held a book of matches. trying to shield it from the driving rain. He met Lila in the absolute center of the bridge. Below them, the world was ending. The roar of the water was a physical force, shaking the iron beneath their feet. The wind screamed, tearing at their clothes. "Get out of my way, girl," Pike roared over the storm, his face a mask of pure, reptilian hatred. "It's over," Lila screamed back, her hair plastered to her face. "The town is here. The marshals are coming. You have nowhere to go." "I have exactly where I'm going," he bellowed, fumbling with a match. "I'm sending this whole town, this bridge, and you, back to the mud you came from. The marshals can't cross a river if there's no bridge." He finally got a match to strike. It flared, sputtering in the rain. "You've already lost." "Pike!" she shouted, standing her ground, her small frame braced against the wind. "You lost the second you put a pen to that ledger." "I lost nothing," he snarled, touching the match to the fuse. "You lost because you forgot one thing." The fuse caught. It began to spark, a small, hissing snake of fire. "And what's that?" Pike laughed, a wild, high-pitched sound. "The truth can swim." He raised his arm to throw the dynamite, not at her, but at the bridge's main support. In that same second, he pulled the derringer from his coat. His plan clear-shoot her. Blow the bridge. He raised the gun. "Coulter!" She screamed. He was already moving. 10 yards behind her, Coulter Hayes, his body screaming, his vision graying out, took his one, last shot. He wasn't a gunman. He was a rancher. With his one good arm, his right arm, he swung the lariat. A single, desperate, perfect loop. The rope uncoiled, singing through the rain. It didn't wrap around Pike. It didn't snag his body. The loop, weighted by the water, flew true and snapped, heavy as a chain, directly across Pike's extended arms. The force didn't pull him. It jarred him. Pike's arm was knocked wide. The derringer fired, cracked the bullet, meant for Lila's heart, went wild. It struck the new iron sign that arched over the bridge. Bitterroot Crossing, Pike's railroad line. The bullet shattered the wood, striking the P in Pike's, and sent the letter spinning into the flood below. The impact of the rope also knocked the oilskin pouch from Lila's grip. It flew, tumbling across the wet planks. The leather journal slid out. The red silk ribbon, the one that had held it all together, came undone. It snagged on a nailhead, catching the wind. It fluttered, a bright crimson banner of defiance in the gray. Monochrome storm. Pike, roaring in rage, tore his arms free from the lariat, the derringer still in his hand. He saw the dynamite, fuse sputtering. Just 2 seconds from oblivion, he lunged for it. Lila lunged, too. Not for the ribbon, for the book. She snatched the journal from the wet planks. Pike grabbed the dynamite, raising his gun again at point-blank range. She didn't run. She didn't cower. She swung, with all her strength, all her fear, all her rage. She swung the heavy, leather-bound book. She swung the truth. It struck Pike's wrist with a sickening, wet thud. He screamed, a sound of pure agony. His fingers went numb. The silver derringer flew from his grip. It spun, end over end, glinting once in the gray light, and vanished into the roaring, muddy water. He was disarmed. He stared at his useless hand, then at her, his eyes full of disbelief. Shouting, he looked up. The world, which had been just the three of them, had returned. Tamsin, Jeb, Bram, Mavis, Pastor Rye, the entire town. They were on the bridge, running toward them, armed with rifles, shotguns, and pitchforks. Pike looked at the dynamite in his other hand. The fuse. It was almost gone. He had one last, terrible choice. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic defeat, and threw it. Not at the bridge, not at the crowd. He threw it high into the air, a final, spiteful gesture. It exploded, a sharp crang high above them, a useless flash of light and smoke, consumed by the storm. It was over. Pike stood, empty-handed, his fine coat soaked, his body slumped. Tamsin Doyle walked up to him, her revolver steady. She didn't speak. She just pulled the iron cuffs from her belt, the sharp, metallic click, click, Click of the ratchet was the only sound. "Bartholomew Pike," she said, her voice flat, cold, and final. "You are under arrest, by order of the United States Marshal." The crowd didn't cheer. They just watched. A low, satisfied, dangerous growl. The young telegraph operator, his face pale, pushed through, carrying a hammer, a nail, and the official, water-stained telegram. He walked past Pike. He hammered the nail into the main trestle and impaled the paper on it. Property of the U.S. government, sealed by federal order. The bridge was no longer Pike's. It was theirs. "Restitution," Mavis Kiln said, her voice shaking but strong. She was holding the one, muddy, sacred copy of the Chronicle. "We have the names. We have the proof. We will have our justice." The tension broke. The crowd surged, surrounding Pike, leading him away. Lila just stood there. The journal was still in her hand. The adrenaline, the rage, the terror, it all drained away, leaving her legs so weak she thought she would collapse. She turned. Coulter was still standing. He was leaning heavily against the iron railing. His good hand clutched the wet rope. His head was bowed, his body shaking from the agony of his arm, from the effort. The rain was washing the mud and grime from his face. He looked up, his eyes, clear and gray, found hers. He was breathing hard, just trying to stay conscious. The roar of the flood, the shouts of the town, all of it faded. She walked to him, the two of them, alone on the bridge. She reached him. She didn't speak. She just stood in front of him. He looked at her, his face a mask of pain, but his eyes were full of a light she had never seen before, a fierce, burning pride. She reached up, her hand still holding the journal, and touched his face. Her muddy fingers streaked his cheek. He let his head rest in her hand, closing his eyes for just a second. His one good arm came up, circling her waist, pulling her flush against him. He held her, tight, anchoring her, anchoring himself, and he kissed her. It wasn't the gentle, trusting kiss from the shack. It was a kiss of survival. It was raw, deep, and desperate. It was the taste of rain, and mud, and gunpowder. It was, "I thought I lost you." It was, "You're alive." It was a promise, shouted over the roar of the flood. Then it gentled, it slowed. It became the kiss from the dawn. A promise. Not of survival, but of living. They broke apart, but didn't separate. They rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air, their bodies shaking. Lila was crying, silent, hot tears that the rain washed away. She whispered the first words she had ever spoken to him, the plea of a terrified ghost in his barn. Don't send me away." He closed his eyes. He pulled her tighter, his good hand gripping her so hard she could feel his heart, his one good arm holding the strength of two. "I'm not," he whispered, his voice rough, broken, and true. "I'm only sending my loneliness away." From the valley, the sound of the train whistle, but it was distant, defeated. The line was sealed, and as they stood, holding each other on the iron bridge, the storm broke. The clouds to the east, heavy and purple, tore apart. A single, clean, brilliant shaft of morning sun cut through the gray, striking them, illuminating the red ribbon that still fluttered, a flag of victory on the wet iron. Justice and love, both won, in the same impossible, breathless moment. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We, here at Wild West Stories 1850, are so grateful to have you. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. We love to hear from you and share our thoughts on these tales. Please, if you enjoyed this story, take a moment to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And if you really want to support us, please hit that hype button, so this story and others like it can be heard by more people.